Hello, and welcome to today's Praxist Table Talk. My name is Vincent, I'm the founder and leader of Praxia, and today we're going to be discussing the significance of symbology within various mythological and meta-narrative accounts. And joining me today, I have a very important member of our leadership, Cody. How are you doing?
I am excellent and very excited for this conversation.
That's good to hear. I'm very excited for it myself. Yes, today we will be discussing, as I said, the significance of symbology and overarching themes that can be found within various mythologies, religious texts, meta-narratives, even going as far down the evolutionary path as to examine different contemporary, fantastical, and fictional narratives and secondary worlds which take inspiration from various older texts and myths, dating back to the ancients. And we're also going to be discussing different ways in which these things can be interpreted, whether figuratively by abstracting the symbols and tropes which are common across various myths, or maybe even literally, as perhaps, we might examine a few real historic events which have become deified or mythologized. And then also we have a few things of our own to present along these lines as well. A couple of us in our group have been world building ourselves. We have our own world building and story crafting side projects that we've been working on. And so we'll be presenting how our own works take part in this wider topic of today's episode as well. So do you have any opening statements before we begin?
Absolutely. I'd say that going into this episode, we will be not willingly conflating, but comparing the religious aspect of things alongside some of the more fantastical and fictional accounts of history, as myth in its original meaning was mythos, is meant to just be stories. And those stories are accounts not only of the gods and goddesses or single god, but of heroes and of great men in society, and the values and virtues that is portrayed or exemplified through these characters, and the vices and pitfalls of society as well, and what differentiates man from beast, the beast that still lives within the man, the relationship between him and nature, and even going so far as the rapid developments of society and our relationship with technology and change overall. And it's important to keep in the back of your head that when we are talking about this mythos, it's not necessarily think of it in the bastardized colloquial context of top 10 myths about X thing, where we perceive it as a lie or a fiction of that sort, but more as a story which holds true beyond the ages of when it's written and beyond the geographical context in which it's held. And that's why we can talk about things in the modern context as well, going so far as like American folklore or going as far back as the epics of Gilgamesh.
Yeah. You bring up that a good point in that the mythos itself is not necessarily it doesn't have to necessarily be a 100% factual account of what happened, but that doesn't make it any less untrue. And I was going to bring this up a little bit later into the episode, but I think it would be a good starting point to discuss really how to interpret mythology and mythological accounts, even in contemporary spheres. So people like J.R.R. Tolkien, for example, could be considered a modern mystic in the sense that he understood these various principles and was able to express them and able to chronologize them in a cohesive story and a cohesive meta-narrative that expanded ages within his own little world. Go ahead.
Before we get into that, though, I will say that tangential but related to this as well in the interpretation of these myths, and they're not necessarily fully accurate accounts, but there is definite historical literacy within myths as well. There are things that actually happened in these myths, and we'll get to that soon too. Just keep that in mind, but continue.
Yeah, so this is an interpretation of mythological accounts which I would consider as corresponding best to the Praxis worldview. And, that is the worldview in which the physical world itself is more or less understood as a dramatization of certain latent and universal principles or forces. But the idea is that many of these myths that arise, even in cultures which may have very little or no connection with each other at all, generally follow a formula which corresponds to some proper formulation of reality, because the perception of primordial or ancient man was capable of innately understanding these principles and interpreting them by giving them a narrative form. And, we know the perception of ancient man obviously went beyond a physical perception in many ways, even more so than ours, due to many things. For example, the conditions they put themselves into. Like a lot of monks go into seclusion and solitude for very long periods of time. Ancient mystics spent a lot of time away from civilizations and in very dense and natural areas. Those are just, two examples, but we have the idea of the seer being someone who is unable to see with their eyes, and sometimes they even physically stop themselves from being able to see things in the physical world so that they can interpret things beyond physicality. So they have a heightened sense of awareness, especially. But whatever the case, there was a way in which primordial man was attuned with reality, that his imagination could perceive the correspondences of principles and forces and symbols and all of that all of those types of things, and dramatize them in a describable fashion. And this is where a lot of myth comes from, not necessarily from within, but from understanding everything without. So one example that can be used here is the idea of a dream state. And in this case, it would be no question as to why the archetype of the mystic is one who isn't necessarily awake, or perhaps it's someone who's seeing beyond what can normally be perceived by, a normal individual. But when you're asleep and dreaming, sometimes the shifting of the weight of the blankets or the changes in temperature in the air or something get translated into your dream as a dramatization of that event. Perhaps you might feel like something is crushing you, or you may picture yourself in a blizzard or something. Or when
I can personally attest to that, yeah.
Yeah, or when in like an external noise or something, like an alarm goes off, you might perceive that in your dream as someone yelling or something. These events, in your dream, these events are real. And outside of your dream, these events are real. But what you perceive in your dream is a symbol and a dramatization of what's happening in reality. Your dream might be the myth, but that doesn't discredit it. And so that's the same idea with the origin of mythology, is that the correspondences of forces within reality might be interpreted differently by various mythologers, or whatever you would call the person who writes down a myth. They might be interpreted differently.
Mythicist, maybe?
Yeah, mythicist. But they all touch upon the same idea, the same correspondences, the same symbols, the same accounts. And whether or not this is because they all derive from one primordial tradition or primordial myth, or whether or not they just arise separately but still have this innate understanding with reality, it doesn't really matter. The correspondences are definitely there. So I feel like we can...
popular theory,
Okay.
just to add on to what you're saying right there, a popular theory in this is the primordial myth isn't so much that there's a primordial sense of things, but that there are dimensions beyond our physical reality that we interact with in some subliminal way, or that we're receiving information from. And that's what a lot of people consider where we get a lot of the images or dreams, or even premonitions, because they're like we just mentioned with seers and things like that in the oracles and prophets of old. These aren't characters that just existed in myths, like I was getting at with the historical aspects of these things. These are people that actually existed for better parts of our history, and even claim to still exist today, although many are exposed as charlatans or grifters or things like that. But it's also a case that many times people have abilities, premonitions. They see things in their dreams or see some event happening in the future, and it could just be randomly to a normal person that happens and never happens again, but they see some instance of a premonitious event that pierces the veil of our reality, and it's almost like a deja vu, but far, far more real. And it's things like this that kind of bridge that gap of myth and reality, on the sense that what we're dealing with is far more close to home. And as much as our enlightened, air quote, modern sciences try to demystify these ancient truths or wisdoms that our ancestors held and that we've either cast aside or forgotten, there is much in the world that we don't understand and much in the world that science cannot give us the understanding of. And that's another aspect on which we hope to focus on a bit.
Yeah. So the idea of myth changing, because I know you mentioned that just now, you mentioned that even especially off call, that these ideas, that different groups and peoples and things like that come together and have a sort of mythos about them. Like I mentioned the Freemasons myth off call, which I'm going to touch upon in the episode. But there's this idea of a founding myth for almost every traditional and long-standing initiatic lineage that exists within our world today. So Freemason is just one, but even if these are as broad as religion or as narrow as maybe perhaps an art style or a fighting style or a nation or something like that, anything.
Some of these are even nested within broader myths or more ancient myths as well, like Freemasonry.
Yeah. So they still have their own myth about them. There's still a founding myth to almost every traditional institution that exists. And while this might not be an accurate account as to the founding of the organization, it's important to have because symbolically it represents the importance of the goal of the institution or of the group or of the family lineage or the fighting style or the art. It is an amalgamation and a timeless representation of what is becoming of the craft or of the lineage, so to speak. So I was thinking that we could start this episode off by talking about the various corresponding symbols that you can find in different mythologies. The most notable one I would say is the doctrine of the ages, right? The idea of a cyclical passing of time from a great age to a very dark age, and this can be found within Hindu, Greek mythology, Norse mythology. So within Hindu, this idea of the great ages is divided up into four. We have the four yugas: the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Dvapara Yuga, and the Kala Yuga. And
which I think everyone is very, very familiar with at this point now.
Yeah, especially with in discourse, even in more Christianized circles, this idea of the four yugas kind of correspond. But just in case anyone isn't familiar with this idea, even the names of the yugas themselves actually have a significant symbol to them. So the Treta Yuga, which is the second era. So the Satya Yuga is like the golden age. It's like the idea of prime spiritual and physical cohesion. There is no theory because there is only knowledge. Everybody knows this. Everybody has an innate connection with reality that there is no need to think there was no need to theorize, I guess you could say, because
like meta instinct.
Yeah, you already know. It is a knowledge, and everyone has this knowledge. Everyone is connected. Everyone plays their function. It is a very holistic and systemically functional time period, both spiritually and physically. And then the Treta Yuga is one age apart from that, and the name Treta actually comes from three in the Hindu language, and it corresponds to 3/4 good and 1/4 of sin in that age. It's one deviation from the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, or the Great Age, in which there is some kind of disconnect, some kind of evil, or rather maybe not evil, but absence of good that has found its way into society at large in this age. And so you get if you look at like a pie, you get the 3/4 of the pie is good, 1/4 of the pie is sin. And then Treta Yuga, which is that's this one. Dvapara Yuga corresponds to 2. and it's half and half. You have a half good and holistic society, and then you have a half evil element to society. And this age is the predecessor to the Kali Yuga, and a lot of people would consider us now living in the Kali Yuga. Even within the Hindu religion itself, we are living in the Kali Yuga, in which the material ages. It is the age of materialism. The focus of society becomes very materialistic. There is no higher correspondence. There is no innate knowledge. Like I said in the first age, there is a focus on wealth and of very temporal elements of reality. And so things like family and love and all of that even get subsided to this pursuit of physical material gain. You're going to say something?
In fact, you could even say that there's a suppression of these higher ideals and values that go towards the deterioration of spirituality and the upholding of, even beyond nationhood, but humanity in general, this collection of higher purpose that all gets thrown aside, suppressed, deviated from, or attacked relentlessly from these agents of material conviction.
Yes, exactly. So that's the age of Kali. The Dark Age is what it is called. And then this also corresponds to an idea in Greek mythology. There's this idea of the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And so obviously the Golden Age corresponds to the Satya Yuga, the very divine and spiritual time in which there is a constant alignment of every principle with its function. The Silver Age corresponds to the time of the sinking of Atlantis. And the Silver Age is actually one. This cycle of ages is one I want to touch upon in popular culture as well, because it aligns very much to Tolkien and his universe, and a few other pieces of media I want to touch upon later. But anyways, Greek mythology has golden, silver. Bronze Age would be like the age of the age where decadence becomes obviously very prevalent, and then the Iron Age is obviously a complete upheaval of society. And this Iron Age also corresponds with the idea of the age of the wolf in Norse mythology. And so this obviously these have very
the Ragnarok.
Yeah, yes. The Ragnarok. Yes.
I was going to touch upon that too, because there are not just with the separations of the worlds, like the Midgard, Asgard, I forget the other seven, but there's a lot. Yunta. It's a very Nordic word.
Jotun.
It's like
Jotun.
Yeah, it's one with the ice giants.
Yes, Jotunheim. Yes,
that's what it is.
Yeah,
and it's not just the separations of the world, but the separations of the ages too, and Ragnarok being the death of the gods and the end of the world, so to speak. And it seems very much like we're in that time now too, especially with some of the highest members of our society, at least contemporarily, saying things like philosophy is dead, God is dead, we killed him, that sort of thing. And
right.
How these very profound, like, proverbial pronouncements have affected us, not just because they were claimed to be, but they were pointed out. Like, this is something that has been going on behind the scenes for millennia, that because of mankind's short-term memory, especially you can see in current events how short-term our civilizational memory is. These things just don't get picked up on, except for some of the higher in intellectual capacity for their ages, like the Nietzsches, the I don't want to say us, because that would sound a little too pompous, but like the Buddhas, the Jesus, all these different figures. That might sound a little weird too, comparing Buddha and Jesus to Nietzsche, but we'll get there in a second.
Yeah, it's the idea of having a innate understanding of the inner workings of the world, and trying to convey that understanding through methods in which normal people might not be able to understand. For example, there's this idea of various religions have an esoteric and an exoteric function. The esoteric would be the inner core, with not a lot of people being able to understand it. It is very small in quantity and high in quality, and it comes from an innate knowledge of the world, which many people don't have. You have to pass through, obviously, trials of initiation and things like that. But besides that, you have to have an inner disposition to understand it itself. And then the exoteric function would be the laws in which the religion kind of carries itself out. And the esoteric function is for people who are, in a sense, beyond the exoteric, beyond the common caste, or beyond the commoner in general. Someone who understands not only that the religion itself says these things, but understands why, and not in a manner that is self-referential, but in a manner that is kind of beyond form. And so, like, for example,
Opposite of what like the secularists that try to demystify these things in science do.
yes,
Like almost the direct opposite.
yes. Like, for example, Evola says, primordial man, in addition to physical perception, also had a psychic or subtle perception of things and places that was generated by a power of the imagination free from physical senses and responsible for determining in it a corresponding symbolical dramatizations. For example, gods, demons, elementals, and spirits ruling over places and phenomena. It is true that there have often been different personifications according to the multiform power of the imagination of various races and sometimes even of different people, but a trained eye is able to see a unity behind this variety, just as a person who is awake is immediately able to see the unity in the variety of impressions created by the diversity of symbols in the dreams of different people. So it's this idea of when you are initiated into the esoteric center of a religion, you are finding the core at which you're finding the heart, which is at the core of almost all proper world religions. So you are, in a sense, involving yourself in a perennial discourse of other people who understand this, but perhaps have come to this conclusion from a different path. Whereas the exoteric is more so confined to time and place. It is the form, whereas the esoteric is the essential. And so the reason I bring this up is because this corresponds to the idea of a perennial philosophy, a Sophia perennis, as has been called, a Prisca Theologia. It's this idea that one true truth lies at the heart of all of these various world religions. And this is something of which Praxism is incorporative. It very much incorporates, our idea of Praxism incorporates this idea of the Prisca Theologia, the Sophia Perennis, this perennial idea of a monistic entity, which is the source and vitality of existence, which then creates and provides everything else within it, or at the very least ordains everything else within it. And this is, so the monad would be the source of this quintessential truth. And then this quintessential truth becomes translated into various spheres of reality through things like religion. So religion would be the translation of the truth, which corresponds to the monad. So it's the form of the function. It's the form of the essence, in a sense. And
it's very interesting, too, to get into the translation of all these similarities between myths, especially the foundational myths of all these civilizations and even religions, because there's so much parallel, like that. Not just, oh, this thing's kind of similar, but very specific, very fundamental beginnings and workings of all these different religions, like what Vincent is saying here, which we try to kind of incorporate holistically through all these different expressions, that there is this monad, that even when there's a pantheon of gods and goddesses and whatever else, there's always the one behind it all. There's always a initial soul creator above all else, that brings about these pantheons in existence, and then they're kind of forgotten about, but they never really go away. They're never killed off. They're never um, uh, given any sense of mortality
Right.
or any sense of corruption. In a sense, they are just the whole, and that's present even in Hinduism, in the Greek pantheons, in um, the Egyptian pantheon, the Norse, and the ancient Chinese, and of course Christianity as well. And
Right.
Christianity even has its own pantheon because of the angels and demons and war of heaven and earth and all that and stuff, because of the rebellion against God, not just through man's sin, but through Satan or Lucifer's, who there's dispute over the interpretation of if that's even the same thing. But regardless, there above all else is just the one that always brings down this knowledge, creation, and even imbuement of godliness to other creatures um, that always primordially existed.
Right.
And it's interesting that that comes about. But not only that, there's a very interesting um, pattern that comes about in all of these creation myths. Water, especially the ocean, is always at bay. Light in creation before the earth is usually there too. Um, what is it? Giants roaming the earth is another common theme, especially even in tales like Fang Ku, which is the ancient Chinese, and Ymir, which is the Norse,
Yeah.
in the pantheon of the Nordic gods with Odin and stuff like that. But even then, there exists this one beyond them all, and the thing that generates these things to rise up land out of the ocean and form earth from the stars in this proverbial light that sounds very, very similar to what early Earth was like before the proper formation of our land masses and our atmosphere and things like that, and the Big Bang as well, which
Yeah.
is, funny enough, the secular myth that has come about, and the mythos of this secular materialist age that we keep referring to, the Kali Yuga, because there needs to be, even in their minds, a foundational basis for which they can explain these questions that we all have, at least at some point in our lives. Even the most lowly of people, the peasantry, if you will, or the lowest of the castes that don't really have any philosophy behind them, might still look up at the night sky and question, how the fuck did this all start?
Yeah.
Pardon my vulgarity, but in common parlance, that would be how people question things. It's like, how,
Yeah,
why? And then they
exactly.
forget about it in like an hour.
Yeah.
But that question will still just sort of grasp, it'll just caress their brain in a way that'll spark that interest there. But because their soul is so low on the chain of material being, they don't pursue it.
Right.
And it's just interesting to see that all of these legends and myths and origin stories of the universe all have these interesting and distinct parallels that keep popping up in completely independent geographic locations in different times and in different stages of development across the world, no matter where it's from. I just find that very fascinating that there's this linkage of the creation across man that's very consistent. There's obviously the unique cultural variations because there is some material imbuement on these things, like the specific animals or geography that's made to better associate people with their surroundings and explain why plants are the way they are. But even then, it's once man is created, man is given dominion over the earth by the gods or that the one, by being able to speak and being able to name everything else around them.
Right.
And you can see that in like the ancient Aztecian creation myths, in the story of Adam in God's creation of Eden, and so many other places too. And it's just fascinating to see this sort of oneness there, that we may be collectively, unconsciously receiving some information from the very distant past that we all know is true, and that some scientific inquiry is backing up, because it is consistent with these other physical realities that we've observed, like the Big Bang and the oceanic Earth before life was even present on the planet, allegedly by the secularist viewpoint.
I believe
And
the
it's
Big
just
Bang was even the Big Bang theory was
coined by a Catholic priest.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
It's and in most and like I wanted to mention the Nietzschean figures, the ones of this sort of like divine insight, as you will, are often the most religious type of people, or at least try to be, even if they see the futility in it, like Nietzsche. Um, you have the Guénons, the Evolas, the Isaac Newtons, or the Socrates and Plato's and Aristotle's, the Caesars, the Alexander the Greats, the Euclids, and the Thomas of Aquinas, and so on and so forth. You have all these different people that not just thought a lot about their actions and consequences and philosophies and what existed beyond them and their mortality, but also acted upon it and did their best to be the most pious men, the most virtuous men, the strongest men too, to bring conquest over a chaotic world and bring order under their reign, like these great men of action, like the Caesars and Alexanders and so on.
yeah.
And it's just interesting to see all these parallels all build up all throughout the ages in this sort of cyclical cycle, but only devolving as we go forward in time. Just keep that there, because we might be coming to a head in this Kali Yuga of sorts, and who knows, it might be ending sooner than we think.
You know, the one of the
nuclear
places
hellfire and all.
One of the yeah, right. But yeah, one of the places where I actually have a disagreement with people like Guénon and Evola is that there's this almost very apathetic attitude that they take towards the Kali Yuga. It's almost in a sense that nothing we do here matters because we're in the Kali Yuga, and so we shouldn't do anything anyways. It's this very defeatist attitude. Ride the Tiger by Julius Evola, even with as much useful information as it gave, it was more so to lament the past and to lament where we're at, more so than to provide anything productive for the individual to try to get us out of the Kali Yuga. But there's this idea that is propounded by most of the traditionalist types, where the Kali Yuga is set to go on for a vast amount of time. And so all of our lifetimes are, futile. And all of the efforts that we bring about to try to stop the Kali Yuga or to try to reverse the cycle or end the cycle is done in vain. And I disagree. And there's a myth.
I do too, yeah.
Yeah, there's a myth in Greek mythology, especially, which corresponds to the idea of the Bronze Age races, so to speak. There's this idea that as the Bronze Age races came about, there was another race that was created, and this was the race of the heroes. And the heroes are the people who can... It is a stock of people who are the last light of that primordial and golden era. It is in a dark age. It is the race of people who can fight against the materialistic forces, the lunar forces, the more feminine forces, and win, not so much in a brutal manner as the Titanic upheaval was, but more so in a truly divine and solar manner, like an Olympian principle would be. And so this idea corresponds with the idea of finding purpose for the individual as well. So the individual is able to, I would say, not the individual in the sense that it is rhetorically used today. You know, we obviously hear of individualism as a big part of today's ideology, especially with secularism, you know, egalitarianism, and all of this. Individualism plays a big part in that. But when I reference it here, I'm speaking more so of an initiated and consecrated individual who fully forms his actions from within. It is the greater type of individual, as opposed to the lesser type of individual who is more so of the masses. But this idea of the stock of heroes corresponds to the idea of the initiated individual, the idea of the individual who follows the path of the heroes out of the Kali Yuga, even if it is only for personal sake. But I feel like if enough of these people kind of come together, if enough of these resources are shared, there might be an event big enough to push us out of the Kali Yuga, if that makes sense.
And I think that's very typical of, I forget the origin of this, but the strong men create good times create weak men create bad times create strong men cycle of things. And that even likens back to Ragnarok again, where it is this great thunderous destructive thing that happens in the realms of the gods that invade these different realms and destroy the different worlds, even affecting, though not directly existing in Midgar, our world, but coming about in a way of a storm and this cataclysmic upheaval, this destruction, like the biblical flood, which, again, another point of reference. There's so much.
I was actually
so many flood stories that come about in these ancient times that always refer to, like, before the dawn of civilization as we know it, this sort of 10,000 years in the making, this 8,000 BC or so, where the first city-states come about. Everyone always references some great flood, no matter where in the world it is. There existed a time before the one we live in now, like this Atlantean Silver Age, that had civilizations far greater than our own, even today, and they were all wiped out in some cataclysmic event. And there's allusion to and reference of this primordial state of being that we've all fallen from, and that may have been a similar event, like a Ragnarok sort of situation coming about too, because in Ragnarok there's the great storm and earthquakes and thunderous upheaval of the world that creates monsters of men, and we kind of destroy ourselves to an extent, just as the gods do. But the gods, in this sense, are the heroes that bring us out of that age, because all of these forces of destruction and evil and so on are the ones attacking this higher ideal of society, of godhood, of heaven, and the harmony in earth. And while the gods may all die in this conflict, just as the heroes might all be sacrificing themselves for the greater good, and if not dying, then finding fates far worse than death, they will have that sacrifice not be in vain, because even amongst all this destruction, all this hellfire, all this nuclear rain that we might be thinking of in the modern context, there will be rebirth, there will be a rejuvenation, there will be a renaissance. And that is the thing that always comes after the night, the destruction, as you will. Yeah. So it is this cyclical nature of things, and that's even present in stories like the Bible or ancient Sumer or Babylon and so on and so forth. And you'll have these stories of great architectural or technological or even pseudo-magical feats of ancient civilizations, like the Tower of Babel or Atlantis or Hyperborea or so on.
Or the pyramids,
that,
even.
Yeah. And the pyramids came after those things, though.
Yeah, I'm
But
just
all of
saying,
these
like, even
things.
these technological feats that sometimes can't be explained by modern science, the pyramid is one of those things too.
Oh yeah, Roman concrete, Greek
Yeah,
fire, so on and so forth.
yeah,
And it was even before things like calculus presumably were invented, but our ancient ancestors figured out things that modern architects are quite literally too stupid to rebuild, even with all the modern technology. We'll
yeah,
put a pin in that. I want to get to that in a second. But it's the hubris of man that kind of brings down the wrath of the gods to squash this development in a way. And that may be through the influence of the gods over man's actions, kind of destroying ourselves, or direct intervention in our attempt to become gods ourselves when that is not our place in the universe. And that leads a bit into what we both want to get into a little later with the left versus right uh, depictions of mythology and their utilizations of that in this new, I wouldn't even say new, but
modern.
re-envisioning of this transhumanist ideology, especially in the global elite that we're all kind of combating today.
Yeah,
But what did I just say? Putting a pin in is the architects
the
thing.
architects. Yeah,
Modern architects. Well, I'll first get onto the technological question, which we'll get into that transhumanist thing I got into. But Vincent also wants to speak in a moment as well.
yeah.
Sorry, this is a lot.
No, you're good. I have a feeling this episode is
Our
probably going to be one of our
it's
longest.
a long one. But our conception of technology today is very much this road of degradation, like we keep explaining with this Kali Yuga, this dark age of devolution. And our technological progress in the modern sense is out of convenience, where we're having machines do more for us than we are using the machines than we have with machines being able to aid us to do more ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Where we'll have these great cranes and tractors and engines and generators and all these different things that we can use mechanically to manipulate the world around us and cause great acts of destruction or great acts of creation, but nothing compared to that which our ancestors made just through raw manpower and cleverness. And many things like that is like I forget where it was, maybe it was Crete or somewhere. There was an ancient Greek lighthouse that was humongous. I man, it bothers me which one that was, but that's just one of the seven ancient
oh, the Lighthouse
wonders
of
of the
Alexandria.
world. I think so. Yeah, the
Yeah,
Lighthouse of Alexandria. It was I think bigger than the Statue of Liberty, and it was made entirely out of the manpower. Or even in closer times, where it's certain cathedrals. I think there's one in Spain where the not spire, but the central dome of it was made in such an asymmetrical fashion that very clever mathematical workarounds had to be gone about over the course of its like 40-year construction that modern architects are still referencing because they wouldn't be able to recreate it even with the technology we had because of how cleverly it was designed. There's like the famous staircase in Mexico in a church. I'm blanking on these names now, but these kind of play into the mythical aspect of things where our ancestors had some sort of linkage to divine knowledge. And the story goes with the staircase is that there was um, a contractor, a woodworker that came in and offered his services to this church and threw everyone out of the church so that he could work alone in peace. And it was just this one woodworker that made this spiral staircase up to the balcony for the choir to sit upon. And it was a perfectly self-sustained helix that's mathematically perfect. It's been studied by mathematicians and architects around the world that have no external nails or glue or anything like this, no timber that was brought in from local, um, uh, what is it, local woodworkers or
like lumber
how has
yards
it,
and stuff.
lumber yards and things. And no one knows how this guy created this staircase or where he came from or how he had the knowledge to create such a complex architectural structure. But it stands there in this church in Mexico. I'll look it up in just a moment to give everyone the knowledge of it. And it's still being studied because we don't know how it was made. And this was in, I think, the 1700s. But that doesn't even compare to things like the Roman aqueducts and the concrete that they were made out of, or other ancient wonders that we're still trying to figure out. The Moa heads are of Easter Island are a common one, but those have more or less been solved because the Moa people pretty much ecologically committed suicide by destroying the island that these heads existed on. So that's why that was the case. They just went so overboard, they ended up destroying everything else around it.
Right.
But those aren't so much a mystery. They just seem so because the island is so barren, but that's only because of what happened in the process of making the Moaheads. Other things like the pyramids or the Lighthouse of Alexandria or the Roman aqueducts and things like that are genuine mysteries that have good theories on how they were built and what could have caused it and the process in which they were made, but no solid explanation or recreation that's been attempted, or if they have been attempted, they failed.
Right.
So that's the point I wanted to make on the architects are too dumb to recreate these things.
Oh no, I mean, kind of going off what you said, I reference a guy named Angel Millar quite a bit because I hope to get him on an episode soon. But I was reading his book and he touched upon something exactly what you are, corresponding to exactly what you're talking about right now. I have a few things actually from his book, but you mentioned one more thing that I just got reminded of.
Real quick. I found the staircase. It's the Loretto Chapel staircase in it was New Mexico. Sorry, not Mexico. Well, it was Mexico for a time. in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have to take a look into that.
Loretto Chapel staircase.
But anyway, so you were talking about technology and the technology that it would take to build this, and you kind of go back to the root word of what technology means and the root of the definition of technology. And so he says that Angel Millar says that ritual initiation is in effect a kind of spiritual machinery or spiritual technology, not in the contemporary sense of these words, but in their original sense, or to point to a historic period in the sense used by the ancient Greeks. By spiritual machinery, we are referring to several interrelated mythic and natural forces, most literally, or in the most outward sense, the machinery or tools of the gods or of the trade or guild, the hammer, the chisel, square compasses, fire, flint, alchemical vessels, and so forth, which appear in the initiation as ritual in the initiation ritual as symbols of a higher and deeper reality. The root of the term machinery is the Proto-Indo-European magana, that which enables. It is related to the Greek word mechane, meaning tools or means, and to the Old English meg, meaning I can, and to the contemporary English word may. In the context of initiation, the machine that enables is the ritual itself, its set of procedures, its movements, and the unveiling of symbols and ritual objects. So he's kind of saying that the act of initiation into any type of lineage, the act that kind of raises the or elevates the ontological status of the being and kind of awakens him in a spiritual sense, can be seen as a machine itself, because you are, in a sense, working with a strict code. You are saying the words that need to be said. You are doing the motions that need to be made. You have the room set up in the way in which it needs to be set up. You've taken the holy water and put it on your head and things like that. It's that type of idea of using these things, these tools, as symbolic interpretations of perhaps the type of blessing that someone's going to go under, or a token of good faith, or something like that, at the very least. But I thought
or an
that was
improvement
cool.
upon man's spirit itself.
Exactly, something of that sort. But that kind of goes back to what I was saying with the various esoteric and exoteric cores. So Jesus was speaking in parables in one of the books in the Bible. I believe it was Matthew. and he was speaking in parables to a group, and one of his disciples comes up and asks him, "Why do you speak in parables? They don't understand what you mean." And Jesus says, "Well, this is because he says, many are called, but only some will heed," or something of the sort. I can't remember the exact quote. It was many will come, but few will understand. That's the general gist. And that's the idea of the principles that we're talking about here, with the esoteric and exoteric functions. But beyond that, I kind of wanted to read another sort of correspondence between various mythological accounts. So Angel Millar brings up a good point on in another one of his chapters in the same book. So he references the Cook manuscript, which is actually one of the mythological accounts of Freemasonry. Because you see, Freemasonry is this organization which has a lot of mystique around its origination. There are a lot of mythological accounts, but the Cook manuscript is obviously one of those things that's more so of a solid reference point for Freemasonry. But anyways, he references it as one of the manuscripts that records the ancient mythology of the stonemasons of Great Britain that later influenced Freemasonry. He says that in this manuscript, Tubal Cain is said to be the father of metallurgy, and his sister Nema the founder of the craft of weaving. Realizing that God would one day take vengeance for mankind's sins, they decided to preserve the sciences on two pillars: a stone pillar that would not burn if God exacted his vengeance by fire, and a marble pillar that would float if he sent a flood. One of the pillars, the medieval manuscript tells us, was discovered by Pythagoras and the other by Hermes. Similar to the stonemason's legend is that of the destruction of Atlantis, as is told by the Greek philosopher Plato. Atlantis was an advanced civilization whose inhabitants were in perfect harmony with divinity. Later, having become corrupt, Atlantis was destroyed by the gods, who sent floods and earthquakes, sinking it into the ocean in a single day. Now, this idea of a flood coming after a wicked period in history also corresponds to the idea of the biblical myth of Noah. The Bible relates this idea of great men of renown who later become wicked. After mingling, I believe it's the sons of God and the daughters of men mingle, and they become, they create this race of giants, and this race of giants itself is bad, and then the men themselves become bad. And that's why he sends the flood for Noah. But before all this,
yeah, sorry, I'm thinking of the name of those giants now. They're
the Nephilim.
Nephilim, thank you. Because there's, just as an aside, there are modern accounts or whispers of Nephilim still in existence today, and those come with varying degrees of legitimacy, but one that's very popular that we might get into is an account by a troop of Green Berets that allegedly were attacked and they killed a Nephilim in Afghanistan. Just keep that in mind as well.
That's interesting. I've never actually heard that, but that's a cool piece of information. But yeah, this idea of, so I guess where I'll start, because there's kind of a lot to unpack here, is that number one, the flood itself is a thing that is common across both of these myths, as you mentioned, Cody. It's not just exclusive to these two, but these are the two which I'm pointing out the similarities in. But so we have the myth of the flood. Before the flood, we have the idea of good men going bad, very spiritual and steadfast men turning into very wicked, very evil, and decadent men. And this is what causes the flood. But before that, we have this idea of, in the Bible, it says that right before this time period, God reduced the time period in which man was able to live. He reduced the tenure of man's life to 120 years. And this corresponds to the idea of a decay from the Golden Age to the Silver Age in Greek mythology, where in the Golden Age, we had these almost invulnerable men with eternal life, basically. which then degraded into the Silver Age, in which there was a cap on the mortality of men, which was created in a different stock of people. But nonetheless, it is still symbolic of this decay from a more immortal primordial state to a mortal human state. And there is a correspondence here in between the biblical myth and the myth of Plato and of Atlantis in this case as well. And so this kind of does correspond obviously to the order of ideas talked about in the cycles of time, the various ages. But it's also interesting to note that modern authors have taken a snapshot of this and put it into their work as well. Tolkien is one that I want to touch upon, so we'll put a pin in that until we talk about these more contemporary authors. But this idea of a flood and of wicked men is found throughout various mythological accounts, but it's also found throughout popular contemporary accounts as well, of fiction and things like that. And let me see here, okay, here we go. So another one of these correspondences between these various myths is the number 12. On one of the footnotes in Revolt Against the Modern World, I don't know if it was actually made by Evola himself or by the translator, but he discusses the number 12. And so he says, the number 12 characterizing the signs of the zodiac, which correspond to the Hindu Aditya, appears in the number of chapters in the Laws of Manu. In the 12 great Namshan of the Circular Council of the Dalai Lama, in the 12 disciples of the Lao Tzu, originally 2, which in turn initiated another 10, in the number of priests of several Roman collegia, in the number of ancilia established by Numa in return for the sign of the heavenly protection he received. 12 is also the number of vultures that gave to Romulus rather than Remus the right to give his name to the city, and in the altars dedicated to Janus, in the 12 disciples of Christ, and in the 12 gates of heavenly Jerusalem, in the 12 great Hellenic and Roman deities, in the 12 judges of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, in the 12 jasper towers built on the Taoist sacred mountain in Kuen-Lun, in the 12 main Aesir and their corresponding dwellings or thrones in the Nordic tradition, in the 12 labors of Heracles, in the number of days of Siegfried's journey, and in the 12 kings subjected to him, in the 12 main knights sitting at King Arthur's round table, and in the 12 palatines of Charlemagne. The list could go on and on. But there's this idea of mathematical and geometrical correspondences between various traditions as well. The idea of sacred art is built upon this idea of very abstract principles being applied within art itself. Frithjof Schuon is a philosopher I reference a lot as well, and he references sacred art as something that is very abstract and symbolic itself. So things like geometry are very much present within sacred art. There's actually a whole subcategory that we can talk about called sacred geometry and understanding how geometry corresponds to the world. And I believe that Plato even had a rule for his temple that if you don't understand geometry, you can't come into the temple. So the symbolism of the cross is another one that's seen in various locations as well. Off the top of my head, the cross represents more holistically the up and down y-axis represents heaven and earth. It represents the physical plane and the more spiritual and more metaphysical plane. And then the horizontal line represents the vertical line represents the metaphysical plane, the degrees of reality, and then the horizontal line represents the degrees of physicality, the physical reality itself. Just off the top of my head. But then it also corresponds to a Native American safety sigil that they used to draw on the ground to protect them. It was used by the Nordics and by various pre-Christian civilizations as a sign of test, or a sign of strength and protection as well, a test of metal. there's a lot of correspondences between the symbolism of the cross as well. And so these are the various symbols that we're talking about that have different types of meanings within various mythologies that these various mythicists have written down, kind of interpreted throughout history, and have given a bigger meaning to as well. We can kind of go
I did want to add with the Goth and sacred geometry as well, because where we may bash the modern sciences in a certain sense, but that's not to throw them out altogether. Like we were saying before with technology and mechanisms and their etymology, science is of itself a tool for man to use, and that had been used for a while at least in responsible, respectable manners, like through the utilization of great men like Isaac Newton, who is like a millennia-defining genius, without doubt. But it's people like oh no, sorry, I confused. You said Schuon before, right?
Yeah.
I confused him with Goethe for a second because I have a quote from Goethe here too.
No, you're good.
It's philosophers get confusing at times, but I wanted to mention Goethe's quote on "He who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living hand to mouth," and kind of brings back that idea of involution or devolution, as we may say, in people's inability to learn from their ancestors and the wisdom that's come before us, and our inability to be humble or gather humility in face of that wisdom. Because we do have, like we said, all these technological achievements and architectural achievements, and people like Isaac Newton that have come before us and given us the foundations for the expansions into our modern technologies, and then albeit vices and whatnot else, and why things may be as miserable as they are, because we're not learning from the people who came thousands of years ahead of us, like how you were kind of just describing.
Yeah. So bringing it back to what I was talking about a little bit before was this idea of the monad, and I know you touched upon it with what you were talking about in how each religion has a singular idea of a monistic principle that kind of creates a whole bunch of other principles which correspond to gods and different deities and pantheons and so on. So I would like to kind of discuss that in a little bit more detail, and discuss the idea of emanationism in general, because different religions kind of correspond to this monad in different ways. Some religions and some mythological accounts characterize this monad as the source of everything. Like, I guess all of them characterize it as the source of everything, but as the more organic emanationist source of everything, with less of a consciousness, but more so a formula that becomes replicated as it develops. And then there are other mythologies which account for this as a type of super consciousness. Christianity would be one such religion in which the monad is defined as a hyper-conscious being, as God, whereas God is the reality himself, or reality itself. He is also the conscious maker of reality and interacts within it. And this corresponds to the idea of emanationism in general, in that the monad is still the source of everything. Everything emanates from it, but the idea of various things within it become differently interpreted if corresponding to the type of consciousness applied to the monad in the mythology. So what I mean by this is, one good example is the notion of evil in various mythologies. Neoplatonists, however you would like to pronounce it, define evil as a lack of good. And, Christianity and more Abrahamic religions would define evil as this thing,
rebellion of God.
Yeah, rebellion of divinity. And both of these are not necessarily wrong. They're not mutually exclusive either. And what I think, one of the best ways I think we can interpret reality in itself is by understanding that it is very irrational, very holistic conception. And the degrees of reality correspond to degrees of divinity and degrees of absolutism and relativism. And within these degrees, there are various things which fester in spheres of relativity, which might not directly relate to things that are more controlled by reality and by the monad itself, which would correspond to these absolute ideas. Think of it like a brain, or like a actual person's consciousness. There are sometimes random thoughts which originate from deep within the brain, in the relative spheres of the brain, which are not consciously controlled by the brain. And those thoughts could be seen as a rebellion against the personality, that, very spontaneous thoughts that might be destructive in some way or might be negative in some way, could be seen as that rebellion against the consciousness. And so the same idea corresponds to our idea as well, with the conception of the monad being reality itself, and then evil spawning from within it in a very relative and unrefined way. And so I feel like evil, the best way to describe good would be to describe it as the manifestation of absolutism and divine principles. And then the best way to define evil would be either a lack of these principles in some form, or a rejection of these principles. And this is what is characterized by various mythologies. It seems that as things
There's another way
more...
of putting it too. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, you're good.
There's also the way of being in tune with nature and being aligned with nature and the natural world and the natural order, that could be like aligned with the gods, but could be separated from it altogether, like is often the claim within the Greek mythos. And the evil in that sense would be a corruption, destruction, or pollution of nature, a setting apart or going against one's nature, as you will. And that's even explored upon in the Epic of Gilgamesh and his counterpart, which they correspond with over that epic as well.
Yeah. But it is interesting to see that this idea of the monad is present within all various religions, even religious formulations. So things like pantheism, which could be seen as a type of lunar or communitarian religion, more so than the solar principles embodied by, more Olympian and Nordic type of religions and mythologies and pantheons. Even that could be seen as a emanationist religion in which there is a monad, just as it can be seen within the various solar philosophies as well. So what we're talking about here is really a holistic correspondence and a holistic understanding from various perspectives of the same principle. That's kind of what I was touching upon in the beginning. But I think that now we can kind of solidify that and move forward a little bit with the conversation, because I do have some myths that I want to touch upon here. I know that you've done your research, Cody, as well, so we can kind of touch upon the various myths that we've looked up. I've looked up myself a large number of mythological accounts of various institutions and traditional lineages. So things like Freemasonry, Hermeticism, things like that, Rosicrucianism. I've looked up the myths surrounding that because I feel like you're going to bring to the table some more ancient and broader myths than these things. So I feel like I could add to the discussion in that regard.
All right, yeah. And right before we get back onto that, what I was trying to say earlier, too, with the adding on the sacred geometry, is how essential mathematics is to all myths. Whether explicit or not, it's once you actually get into the foundations or the reiterations or the telling, or even some of the central themes of these myths, mathematics plays a very central role. And some of that comes into how they're spoken, like the epics and poems that depict these myths are often given in the poetic verse. And poems are a mathematically structured form of language that has always been a part of human language. It's very interesting in how the cadence and array of the words line up, how they rhyme with each other, the meanings and entendres that play a part in, and it's been exhibited all throughout human history in such a mirrored way all across the different civilizations of the earth, where you have different pentameters of speaking, like the Odyssey and the Iliad being in iambic pentameter, which I think is the five syllable pairs, and things like Paradise Lost, which we'll get into as well in this coming up discussion, being in the iambic pentameter, which is the four. But even beyond that, there's things in music and the golden ratio, with various forms of arts and artistry, and how harmony and the synthesis of different sounds and frequencies plays a role in even the religious, let alone the mythological aspects of civilization, and how these things all line up, how it affects us psychologically, and moving from that spiritual domain into the more physical reality of things. And this has been a central role of mathematics, at least subconsciously throughout all of human history, that we're just now in modern mathematician circles starting to uncover, and realizing that our ancient ancestors were well ahead of their time, at least in our eyes, on using these mathematical concepts, even if they didn't fully understand it, or even if we don't fully understand it, but they did. And that's, again, something with modern man's hubris and not understanding our ancestors by taking those 3,000 years or more, as Goethe said, and not living just hand to mouth like so many are in modern society. But Vincent, go off.
Well, actually, you bring up an interesting point, kind of taking it back to the idea of geometry and sacred art, and it reminded me of a few different symbolic elements that I wanted to touch upon in the realm of art as well. So Frithjof Schuon, he put a big emphasis on beauty and sacred art as two vital areas to focus upon when discussing tradition and philosophy and things like that. He says that the function of beauty is to actualize in the intelligent and sensitive creature the recollection of essences, and thus to open the way to the luminous night of the one and infinite essence. So it does correspond to that idea of the monad. And for sacred art, he says that sacred art is full of all of the visible and audible forms, I'm guessing he meant to say, but there's a typo here. Sacred art is first of all the visible and audible forms of revelation, and then also it is indispensable liturgical vesture. So in a sense, what he's saying is kind of goes back to what you were saying, Cody, that not only is this mathematic approach to art present in things like geometry and things like that, like we were touching upon earlier, but it's also present in things like you were talking about, the 5-syllable lines. It's present within poetry and within music as well. There's a big mathematical element to music as well. Especially
octaves and the different levels thereof.
Yeah.
Hertz and their frequencies, especially in tuning instruments like the piano. It can go on for hours if we really want to get into it. But to save us and you the trouble, we won't.
Yeah. But there's 3 essential symbols that generally characterize sacred art, and this would be the triangle, which represents the triad of essences. In Christianity, it's seen as like the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but there's a bunch of other mythologies which account for a triad as well. Egyptian mythology is one of them, but there's quite a bit. The next symbol would be the square, And this kind of does correspond to the cross as well, with it being a quadrilateral understanding of a more holistic principle. And then there's the circle, which is the symbol of the monad. Actually, the symbol of the monad is the circle with another dot inside of it, denoting a kind of an inner and an outer. And so these are, you mentioned off call, Cody, that these were the symbols of alchemy as well. And these are the symbols which characterize sacred art and are embodied by art pieces which can be considered as sacred. And so a lot of traditionalists like to abstract the art as much as they can, and they'll put value only on art which embodies these symbols very explicitly. But I feel like that's another area where I differ from them, in the sense that you can find these pieces of art, or these elements of sacred art, present within pieces that might not be seen as sacred to begin with. Like, for example, Pablo Picasso's Cubism, I believe it is, and things like that, which kind of take on this symbolism in a new way. But that's a little bit beside the point as well. I just kind of wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that even relates to thinkers like Pythagoras and his denotions of things like the pentagram and the mathematical applications thereof, and how certain geometries like that start to devolve into disunity. And things like the pentagram are often related to satanic imagery, like in the Bible, which we might get more into as well. But that's kind of those central tenets on the not just necessity, but foundational aspects of mathematics in mythology and in the universe as is.
Yeah.
Getting in to those mythologies now.
Yeah.
Now that we have most of the groundwork laid forth.
Yeah.
What's one of the first that you wanted to get into?
Well, I guess we could talk about Christianity, because there's a lot of stuff to understand within the Christian mythos. Because it is a mythos, even though a lot of it is recorded history. There's a lot to discuss.
It's a story, like we said at the beginning.
Yeah, it is an account. It is a mythologized history. And so we can kind of deconstruct these symbols found in there. I've kind of touched upon the broad ones, but one thing I think that doesn't get noted a lot is that Genesis is a very, very long chapter, though it may be short in verbiage, if that makes sense. Genesis is kind of the chapter, or the book, excuse me. Genesis is kind of the book that outlines both the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and it even kind of touches upon part of the Bronze Age. There's a really big setup and decline, and a discussion of primordiality that goes on in Genesis that is found almost nowhere else in the Bible. I believe, like we were mentioning, the Nephilim, they were mentioned only in Genesis and then once in Enoch. They had those two appearances in the Bible. So they're not very widespread at all. But what I think is within the Bible is not only probably one of the best ways to live your life, one of the best expressions of these divine principles, but also there is a lot of hidden gems that do kind of touch upon these esoteric concepts that we've been talking about, that legitimize them from a Christian perspective, that I think a lot of Christians don't see. The Nephilim being one of them, the idea of the esoteric function being another one. But yeah, I think that...
And to add to that, I think there is a lot that, especially modern Christians, do not see in the Bible, especially when it comes to the Old Testament, because of so much disillusionment that's come towards Christianity and the attacks on it. And it's one of the reasons why I've come to understand the Catholic Church's incentive on having the interpretation of the Bible through the head of the church, through the pastor, priest, or someone who's been educated properly and formally in its not just reading, but the secrets it holds in reading in between the lines. Because there is a lot that goes on in the background, especially even in Genesis and other books thereof. And that is why there's such a degradation in um, the presentation of Christianity now, and why it's so easy to straw man is because people have kind of walked away unconsciously, mostly, that not really realizing that they've been taken away from the faith as is, but they've been walked away from the true wisdoms and truths that are present within the pages of these stories and this mythos altogether, that are the product of either direct divine intervention or aeons and aeons of wisdom that have had generations upon generations of men, many of which far wiser and greater than ourselves, studying this relentlessly to truly figure out the meanings and the applications thereof. And a lot of that, even though much of it kind of came about in the last 500 years or so, much of it has already been forgotten because of the effects of things like the Industrial Revolution and so forth. Going from there, though, what was one of the first things you wanted to get on with Genesis?
Oh, and it was just touching upon it as a whole. It has.
Oh, okay.
It's one of those books of the Bible. It's the only book of the Bible besides Revelation, I think, that touches upon a very expansive time period, and so it focuses upon Adam and Eve before the fall, and the fall can kind of be corresponded to the idea of the first and the second era, the Satya Yuga and the Treta Yuga. After the fall, men become mortal, but they become a little bit more knowledgeable, especially in the physical realm, whereas in the primordial age, in which the Garden of Eden takes place, there's a more attunement with the world, with divinity, but there's less of a knowledge. There's less of an ability to cognitively think. And so I find that interesting as it corresponds to the idea of the Golden and the Silver Age, in which the Golden Age, there is that constant alignment of the mortal principle with the immortal one, and the earthly, more naturalistic principle with the spiritual one. And then in the Silver Age, is characterized by a decline. It's characterized by a bit of mortality. And after that, we see a differentiation in symbolism of masculinity and femininity. Even within
I was gonna bring that up next.
Yeah. We see a differentiation in between masculinity and femininity. In Christian symbology, it was Eve who did take the apple and have a more worldly approach, and the feminine symbol has always been equated with a worldly approach. But as
even in the depictions, oh sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, even in the depictions of the two worlds, the heavens and the earth, typically, though not always, in mythos around the world, earth is very motherly and the sky is very fatherly, especially in the depiction of the God of the Bible being of the heavens beyond the firmament and so forth, and the devil being cast down from heaven and falling into the garden and so forth, tempting Adam and Eve, and this world being far more motherly, Mother Earth, Gaia, that sort of deal, which
right.
Something I want to get into a little later. But I also wanted to mention that there is this feminine aspect of things alongside this fall from Eden or from paradise, both in the Christian world and also in the Greek myths as well, with Hermes giving man, women, and as in Pandora, and the box that holds in all of the demons of the world that Zeus and the other gods trapped within it, and how Pandora comes about opens the box and then releases literal hell on Earth. Um, Eve doing much the same thing, and many people also forget about the story of Lilith that comes about before Eve, and how that kind of messes things up with, or I wouldn't say messes things up, but gives more background into the nature of women as is in this motherly, or not motherly, but earthly figure of Mother Nature and chaotic, vengeful nature as it is, especially eating of the fruit and so on else.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that it's all bad, but with the unleashing of hell and mortality upon man in both the Greek and Christian perspectives, there is the knowledge of good and evil. And even though evil has been brought about and has destroyed Eden, good can still come of it through man's own will. And the same with Pandora and the box. At the bottom of the box, there is hope, and there is the virtue that can be brought about through hope that is given to man, even with his new and imbued mortality. Because in the Greek mythos too, men kind of sat upon the earth and were immortal creatures by the gods' creations to occupy the land as a creature that has domain over the physical realm, while the gods inhabit Olympus. That all comes to an end when women get involved, which unfortunate, but here we all are.
But yeah, it is prevalent, especially in the story of Genesis, and even more symbolically than just Eve taking the apple or the fruit. In Cain and Abel, the story of the two brothers, Cain embodies a more inverted masculine principle, while Abel embodies a more feminine principle, less inverted than Cain's masculinity, but still a more passive, a more I don't want to say pacifist, but a more peaceful oriented principle. Whereas the masculine principle, after this primordial spiritual time, becomes very enraged. It becomes very angry. And so this is where I believe you see a differentiation between the warrior and the priest caste after the primordial spirituality, after the myth of the fall. And this does actually correspond to the myth of the Greeks. I was going to kind of touch upon that, because this idea of a masculinity, a masculine superiority over the feminine principle, only goes so far, because even if the masculine principle takes back, or in a sense re-raises itself to divine status, if it does so in an if it attempts to do so in a negative or very harmful way, that's still seen as bad. For example, Julius Evola says in the Cycles of Decadence and the Heroic Cycle, he mentions this. He mentions that after this fall, after the period of androgeneity and spiritual alignment and stuff, after the turn of the Silver Age, there's this duality. The more monistic principle of humanity becomes a dyad. It becomes man and woman. And so then he says, on the basis of the duality man-woman, which is the premise for the new types of civilization derived by the involution from the primordial civilization, which was the golden age that I was mentioning, it is possible to define the following types. The first type of civilization is the Titanic one in a negative sense, and refers to the spirit of a materialistic and violent race that no longer recognize the authority of the spiritual principle corresponding to the priestly symbol or to the spiritually feminine brother, like Cain versus Abel, like I mentioned. And he says that this race affirmed itself and attempted to take possession by surprise and through an inferior type of employment of a body of knowledge that granted control over certain invisible powers inherent to things and people. So therefore this represented an upheaval and a counterfeit of what would have been the privilege of the previous glorious men, namely of the virile spirituality connected to the function of order and domination from above. And he gives the example of Prometheus, who usurped the heavenly fire in favor of the human races, and yet he didn't know how to carry it. And so the fire became the source of torment and damnation until it was freed by another hero, which was Heracles, who was worthier and more reconciled with the Olympian principle. That's how he puts it. And so later on, he references a different type of civilization that he talks about. He talks about a more feminine type of civilization next. He goes on and talks about the Amazons and the Amazonian principle. And a lot of these principles, which he characterizes with Greek names, correspond to other types of civilizations as well. It's just that the Greeks had such a developed mythology that you're able to define the principle by kind of relating it to a race or a stock of people in Greek mythology. But
I'd say that it helps that the Greeks were so well recorded too.
Yeah,
that's probably why.
Yeah. So he says that a second type of civilization must also be considered. The pair always comes first. There is, however, a crisis, and the feminine primacy is upheld through a new principle, the aphrodistic principle. The mother is replaced then by the hetera, the son by the lover, and the solitary virgin by the divine couple that, as I've suggested in previous mythologies, often characterizes a compromise between two opposite cults. But the woman in this context is not Hera, who was subordinated to Zeus, although always scheming behind his back. We do not even have, as in the Far Eastern synthesis, the Yang principle, which pertains its active and heavenly character vis-a-vis the Yin principle, which is the feminine and earthly complement. Instead, the chthonic and infernal nature penetrates the virile principle and lowers it to the phallic level. The woman now dominates the man as he becomes enslaved to the senses and mere instrument of procreation. Vis-a-vis the aphrodistic goddess, the divine male is subjugated to the magic of the feminine principle and is reduced to the likes of an earthly demon or god of the fecundating waters. In other words, to an insufficient and dark power. From this theme derive, analogically and according to different adaptations, types of civilizations which may be called aphrodistic. This could be yet another meaning of the theory of Eros that Plato associated with the myth of the androgynous beings whose power was shattered when they became two, male and female. And so then he goes on to talk about the aphrodistic type of society. But all of this stuff, which he's describing as characterized in Greek mythology, does take place in Genesis in various ways. You see, like the myth of the fall, the myth of the of Cain and Abel, of the different principles and devolutions that people undergo in relation to the flood, things like that. These are the types of correspondences which you can see in Genesis.
And it's there in so many other mythoses as well, like he mentioned with the yin and yang, and that came about in the Fang Ku story as well, which it hatched from the proverbial egg is another creation myth or categorization of creation that is almost a genre in and of itself, of the world hatching from this egg, and these creatures or creation itself coming about from the expansion thereof. Again, similar to this concept of like the Big Bang, where everything is condensed down to this one state and then suddenly released out of like a hatching. Very interesting that ancient civilizations kind of had this conception of the world that now secular sciences back up. But again, Fang Ku is this sort of balance in between the androgynous spirit, although he is mostly referred to as male. It isn't explicitly so in the creations of the heaven and the earth, like the feminine being the earth in, what is it, Yang, right?
Yeah. No,
yeah, and then the sky.
The heavenly principle is Yang.
Oh, okay. So then, the Yang with the male being the sky and heavenly, and Yin being earthly and female, and then Fan Ku doing his own thing as being a giant and so forth. And all these parallels kind of line up across all these different mythoses of peoples independent of each other.
Yeah, and so I do think that there's a lot to unpack in that regard. So I'll just leave it at that for Genesis. Do you kind of want to touch on something that you have written down before I go into like the more vocational myths?
Ooh, well, I feel like we've touched upon some of the most prevalent already, like the most relevant that we need to at the time. We can get into specific myths and stuff maybe in a future episode and explore their impacts later. But right now, I think we should move on.
Okay. In that case, then I will touch upon the idea of Hermes Trismegistus and the Hermetic tradition, because the Hermetic society is one that has a long laundry list of origin myths and theories that surround it and everything. But as it generally goes, there's this text called the Corpus Hermeticum, which is, in a sense, the Hermetic Bible. It is I guess the best way to describe it would be that it is an unsourced esoteric text which is very supplementary to religious texts like the Bible, especially Christianity and Egyptian and Greek religion as well. So the idea goes that there was an author named Hermes Trismegistus who is actually a combination of the god Hermes from Greek mythology mixed with the god Thoth from Egyptian mythology. And this was this figure who was a mix of these two principles that came about because of the Greek invasion of Egypt and the various undergoings that had to happen for the Greek religion to kind of be supplementary to the Egyptian religion, or vice versa, thereafter.
Real quick, I think the Egyptian god's name is pronounced Tot. Not trying to nitpick you, but
I've heard
the pronunciations are weird.
I've heard it pronounced so many different ways. I've heard Toth, Thoth.
I believe it's Tot because it's the one with the head of the ibis, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, because him and Hermes are supposed to be mirrors of each other, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's Tot.
Yeah. Well, anyways, regardless, it's a merge of those two principles. This idea of Hermes Trismegistus, and Trismegistus is supposed to mean thrice blessed, or blessed 3 times over. So you do have a correspondence with the idea of the triangle, or of the 3. So he's considered to be the mythological author of the Corpus Hermeticum, which has a functional doctrine, I guess you could say, and then a more philosophic doctrine. So it has two different parts to it. But this is a text that is attributed with creating the Hermetic Society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and other offshoots of that organization, which really, its mythos is largely embedded within medieval society, but you don't see much of it. Same thing with the Freemasons. You don't see much of it until a little bit after the medieval society. But it is a group that is very much aligned with, in some way, with the idea of the perennial philosophy and the Prisca Theologia and these different, more so harmonious myths that we've been talking about today. Another one that I wanted to touch upon was the idea of Freemasonry. Freemasonry obviously has a bunch of different myths. A large part of it is embedded within medieval society as well, as these different stonemason guilds would organize and keep the secrets of the craft of stonemasonry locked up within the various, esoteric orders and things like that, as it was passed down through initiation, and there was largely no text. It was mostly oral tradition. Obviously, that's just one interpretation or one idea, but
yeah,
the thing that
go ahead. To comment on the Masons and their myths, I did a lot of digging into them because I almost became a Freemason myself. I looked at my local lodge and just spoke with the members thereof, and spoke with actually a Grand Mason. He was like a friend of, or he was the father of a friend of my mother's, and he actually was in charge of orchestrating and um, uh, maintaining communication along all the different lodges of the entire eastern seaboard of the United States and Canada,
Wow.
which he was a very influential guy for sure. Um, but going into the mythos there, it is a very Christian-centered one, and there is different, um, I guess, origin stories depending on the nation of Masons that come about, probably for how the lodges were started for each masonry, but the quintessential mythos that comes about them is the master builder and master mason Hiram and building of the Temple of Solomon,
Hmm.
I believe.
Yeah.
And that's a story of betrayal and hierarchy, order, chaos, death, and God himself. And what is this kind of like a Cain and Abel story as well, but more on a basis of caste, not really of fraternal nature, even though it evolves into a fraternal order. Funny as that is.
Yeah. I would definitely recommend looking into various Freemasonry myths as well, because there's a lot of different ones. Obviously, there's still some kind of synthesis between them, but the general idea that I'm trying to get at here is that these are expressions of these various myths as well. So, with the Hermetic Society, you have they were mostly involved with things like alchemy and later on chemistry, and Freemasonry was obviously stonemasons and stuff. But the idea is that in the modern sense, with the modern mentality, these organizations would have no business involving themselves in religiosity, divinity, sacrality, and things like that. They would really only be purpose for their craft, in the same way that a trade union might be organized today. And this is why I like to understand the mythoses behind these various organizations and the craft which they partake in, because to them the craft is only the expression of the divine. It's the expression of the universe within them, and then they create the thing that they make. So by joining one of these orders, you're not just joining a vocation, but you're joining a traditional lineage that's going to be able to teach you these other things, these other more holistic principles about life and stuff like that, while also giving you a solid craft to learn. That's the idea. And
on top of that, it brings you into the fold of a very powerful collection of people, whether or not individually they hold power, though given all the fright and festering that people point to the Freemasons on, like, oh, they control the world, like Illuminati, stuff like that, there might be credit to some degree of that, considering who have been uncovered to be Freemasons, especially like the founding fathers all being part of Masonic lodges and so on. Even still, if you take all that away, just this collection of men who wish to pursue a higher archaic knowledge, if you will, that these hidden truths of reality under this pursuit of spirituality, there is a connection there that binds you even more than familial ties in many cases. And you could be complete strangers, but if you're both Masons and you both signify that with each other, within reason, there will be people that give life and limb at times for fellow Masons and will bend the rules of wider society for this brotherhood, because there exists a fundamental understanding and mythos behind them that they all agree to and abide by and live by once they become part of this court.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not just the case with Freemasons as well. That's the case with other initiatic societies also. kind of going a little bit off topic here, but the same idea is applied with the idea of the mafia, especially in its roots, which began as kind of a political backlash to the Union of the Kingdom of Italy. And it was kind of
we've touched upon before in a previous episode.
Yeah, we have. But I'm just kind of noting the similarities there. But yeah, it is interesting to look at, and that is kind of the importance of looking at these various organizations and understanding the mythos behind them, because these myths, while being very narrative in nature, are symbolic at their core, and they require a general understanding of the inner workings of reality to really pick apart. For example, the book of Islam, the Quran. I don't know why it took me forever to think of it, but the Quran is said to have 7 different words or 6 different words or something like that or 7 different meanings for each word that is written in the Quran. And then for Sufis, it is said to have like 7,000 different meanings for each word. So it really depends on how you interpret these myths as certain truths, both abstract and more historic. But I think that's kind of all I wanted to touch on in that regard as well.
And I'd say that's a great segue into the reason behind this episode altogether, and why we're talking about these myths and bringing them up seemingly sporadically and unrelated to what we're trying to aim at. But the foundational principle of the matter was that all of these myths correlate with each other, even though they may exist completely independent of one another, geographically, temporally, what have you. They all touch on certain transcendental truths that go beyond just the men who may have originally wrote them or may have been inspired to proclaim them to the world. And that's the goal of Praxia in a spiritual sense, is to show that the expressions of what we pronounce to be Praxism is all of these different cultures having the same fundamental presuppositions and these same inspirations and the same reality we're all looking at, just with a different aesthetic here and there because of the unique cultures that come about in these different places.
Right.
But fundamentally, they're all the same, and we're trying to bridge these gaps here, these chasms that exist between different cultures and divides, that they're not so different over there. They're, in fact, much like us. Most of what divides people in this sense is the
loyalty to
politics
form
of the day.
Oh, yeah.
And the loyalty to form.
Yeah.
Those two are the fundamental corrupting factors there, because it's this involution into the material realm that keeps people at like the blood and soil of nation and so on and so forth. And that's not saying that those aren't important, that everyone's individual nations and expressions thereof are extensions of themselves into their wider communities, like we've spoken on as well. But getting onto the spiritual matter, if we want to get beyond this Kali Yuga, this Dark Age, this Iron Age, as we call it, then we have to be able to transcend these cosmetic divides that keep pushing us and pulling us against each other, because those at the helm of things, the powers that be of the world, may be in competition with each other in some aspects, but they are all far more unitary in their goals and in this destruction of mankind, if you could, that they're all kind of pointed towards, regardless of whatever politician is your flavor of the week that you say once represents you or whatnot, whether it be Putin or Xi Jinping or Joe Biden or whatever. There are fundamental depravities in each of those men that only perpetuate this destructive and materialist nature. Pragmatic in a sense too, but are not the end all be all of what we want. Some are better than others, like we've mentioned, and like what we've given credit to. But the ultimate goal of this is to show that there exists reality far beyond just the politics of Earth. And that is what we're trying to demonstrate through the myths that have been orchestrated by men all throughout the world and keep getting perpetuated even into today. And hopefully, us being able to inspire people or help instruct people on how to create these new myths for these new generations, including for Praxia itself, to hopefully overcome this period of degeneration that is the Kali Yuga, if you will.
Yeah. And there have been sporadic instances in which these myths have become translated into popular fiction as well. I think it's a good segue into that. I touched upon J.R.R. Tolkien a little bit earlier. His mythos is one which embodies the characteristics of the traditional society and the idea of capital T tradition or of Praxism as well, very well. His world, well, first of all, I'll talk about some of the similarities between his world and what we've touched upon so far. First of all, his world goes through various stages, various ages. There's the first age, there's the second age, the third age, and I believe there is a fourth age. There is a fourth age which ends at the end of Lord of the Rings, but it's not much discussed in his mythology. He's more so concerned with the primordial era of the gods and stuff like that, and its descent into the second era, which would be like the Silver Age, and then the third era, which is more so the reign of evil over good. It's kind of half and half in that regard, but he doesn't much touch upon the issue of the Kali Yuga. Nonetheless, we can still see some of the same symbols within his mythology that we see within other mythologies as well. For example, the elves are seen. The elves are like that primordial, universal people, right? These are the archetype of being spiritually aligned with the universe and stuff like that. You have the idea of the monad in Eru Iluvatar, who is his interpretation of God, and then the emanations that he makes is the various Valar or the Ainur, however you want to call them. But beyond that, you also have the myth of the flood and of the men of Numenor. Numenor was supposed to be this island that was off the coast of Middle-earth. And it was populated with people who were of a better stock than anywhere else in Middle-earth. It was men who were of a higher stock, of a higher caste, if you will. And they, over time, they succumbed to their worldly nature, their humanly nature. Their lifespans began to decay, and they invited an evil deity over to become counsel to them. And after a time, their island fell into water. They tried to take war to the godly figures of the mythos, and their island fell due to a flood. And the various civilizations that popped up after the flood can correspond to the real life civilizations that popped up after the myth of Atlantis. So there is a huge correspondence between men of renown who become evil, between primordial immortal man who becomes mortal, even a principle of a monad, which then becomes a principle of a dyad in between the Valar and the elves. And then you can see the various overcomings of evil, which signify different ages, but nonetheless bring upon a more darker age than previously before, than the one that came before. So there are a lot of correspondences between Tolkien's universe and the various myths which he expounded upon, in a sense.
And that's also reviving a lot of the lost myths and folklore of the English Isles and the creatures and mythologies and origin stories of things like elves and fairies and um, different swamp peoples and things like that that exist throughout Scotland and Ireland and Wales and so on, that were kind of erased in the English domination of the British Isles, but also the Christian domination of the English Isles as well, as has happened, unfortunately, with many of the rising kingdoms of Christendom across Europe. And much of it has been revived, fortunately, throughout different archaeological digs and investigations to try and understand these people's pre-Christianity, and that has given us things like the prose and poetic Edda, which I think was some of the inspiration for Tolkien as well, but
Yeah.
mostly from these more homely representations of mythology around him and the stories that he grew up with in the tales unique to his home. But that still translates to all these other creatures and mythologies and folklore all across the world in different avenues as well. And that is very much what happened with his contemporaries in C.S. Lewis and H.P. Lovecraft and other men of his time that either experienced the horrors of World War One or knew a time before the Industrial Revolution and saw the effects afterwards, and so on and so forth, and how these rapid changes in society and the losing in touch of our ancestral spirit, more or less, has affected mankind, and the weird inversion or inhuman development of humanity that has gone on in the last 200 years or so.
Yeah. One idea that I did forget to mention earlier that I wish I would have brought up when I did touch upon most of this stuff, kind of corresponding to the monad, is the idea of the symbology of the monad is of a dot within a circle. And a lot of these myths have a correspondence to a center, a stable center of the world or of the universe. And a lot of cosmogonies have physical reality at the center of metaphysical reality, whether this be in a type of raindrop shape or whether it be a circle. There is an idea of us being in the center of the world or of the center of the universe. And in various traditions, this is seen as well. Midgard, for example, is the center of the world in Norse mythology. China likes to declare that we live within the Middle Empire. And so this idea of being in the middle of something is also translated into Tolkien's world by having Middle Earth be his main continent. But that's just one extra thing, is that there is this idea of us being in the center of the world and of everything kind of revolving around this center, but also this center itself being kind of changeable and relative as well.
Well, you can even see that in narrative works that are even more contemporary than Tolkien and Lewis, as The Watchmen and the figure of Dr. Manhattan, where the symbol he chose to present himself in as more or less the center point of the entire narrative of the Watchmen graphic novel, which is reflective in the symbol he gave himself, is of the hydrogen atom, which is this circle with a dot in the center of it and this other circle orbiting around it. And that is very much the atomic simplicity of the basis of all of nature, with this stable center being the why did I suddenly forget my chemistry? Not the neutron, but the proton. Whew. The proton, and then the electrons that orbit around it, with this very simple, very, very simple first building block of all the rest of nature. The thing that fuels the sun, and the thing that exists in the majority of most of our bodies, the thing that gives us life through water and its combination with oxygen and so on and so forth. And that's the symbol that Dr. Manhattan gives himself in becoming this god-like figure. And even then, even though he's given all these powers, he's still but a man, and he can't contend with or fully control the powers he's been given, which further demonstrates the hubris of mankind in our will to be God, where even if we were to achieve that, we wouldn't know what to do with ourselves, and
Right.
we would probably just end up hurting everyone around us.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of touches upon the idea of pleasure as well. It's like seeking to raise ourselves to that godlike status is, in a sense, a seeking of the highest pleasure, or even that becomes kind of destructive as well. But
Moving on, though,
Yeah.
there's not just the like I keep mentioning C.S. Lewis. His Chronicles of Narnia are very similar to Tolkien, and I feel like people focus too much on Tolkien and forget about C.S. Lewis and his narrative that he built with the Chronicles of Narnia, because
agree.
they are very they are just as influential and just as well written and just as fleshed out as Middle Earth and the adventures thereof, because it is even demonstrates even more of a Christian narrative, as Tolkien said is demonstrated in the Lord of the Rings, because you have almost one-to-one comparisons with Jesus into Aslan in the whole Chronicles series, and other characters like the Wicked Witch being far more sympathetic in her introduction in The Magician's Nephew, which is the first book of the whole series, and then developing into this fallen character and a very feminine character thereof, where she's guided by this emotionalism that corrupts her, essentially, and gives rise to this death and resurrection of Aslan and this great war that comes about, where all these kids from England sort of get caught up in, but it still demonstrates all these purposes of this fight between good and evil, and God and the devil, and so on and so forth, in a completely different world altogether, but still feels real, no matter how fictionalized it is, because of the symbology and mythology and everything else that is demonstrated there. And you have all sorts of different characters and creatures like centaurs and fauns and other types of mythological beings like great sea serpents and these other what is it when there is these destinies foretold that give rise to events that occur, much like how the prophets of old are writing down these events that will happen in the future, or the consequences of certain events that will be partaken if society falls down this path of darkness, like we can very much see is being demonstrated in the modern world.
Right.
And that only gets back into the cyclical version of things, which, again, is demonstrated in works like the Chronicles of Narnia. But that's a very heroic and positive sort of vision of this world that I think figures like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are very admirable for. But there's also the darker end of things, which I wanted to get in with H.P. Lovecraft and his generation of his mythos.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to get into that. So I like to characterize Lovecraft as kind of the amalgamation of a Nietzschean popularity, and a popularity of the horror genre in general, along with the emerging secondary worlds and various mythopias that have been created by different authors within that same time period. So you have Dracula is a main one that's been referenced. Frankenstein. You have the Brothers Grimm narratives that were going around at that time, as well as very Darwinistic philosophies, nihilistic philosophies. And all of this, I think, played into the mindset of H.P. Lovecraft and his craft of a cosmic horror and of a worldview of reality in which we are but little things. I don't want to say purposeless, but with less function than most previous mythologies would have.
Almost like
granted
a
us with.
demonstration of the powerlessness of man.
Yeah, that is a very good way of putting it. Powerlessness.
That's a bit like.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, that's a bit like Dostoevsky's interpretations of the changing times in the turn of the last century as well, which I think Lovecraft went a different route in that perspective of this Nietzschean sort of philosophy, and Dostoevsky just got depressed.
Yeah.
Whereas Lovecraft was definitely more charismatic in how he demonstrated this change.
Yeah. And you did mention off call that, Lovecraft did spawn this whole new genre of literary horror called, the Lovecraftian genre. And, his works were actually interpreted into another literary and even entertainment secondary world, which I think I might get into here.
And his pantheon of eldritch gods that he created is so complete and gets true to the matter of these mythos that we keep getting at, that there are some people that theorize he may have had some ancient archaic knowledge that he was given or presented to, and people try to argue that it could be made into an actual religion or some like Atlantean level societal religion that existed before civilization as we know it, and Lovecraft was tapping into this. And I think there are some followers of that unironically as following this mythos as a real like religious philosophy.
The Typhonian
that they practice
order
in their lives.
The Typhonian order is one of those in which certain Lovecraftian tropes were translated into various rituals within the order itself. And so it's funny that you mentioned that, because I had just pulled that up. But yeah, it was one of these. There were a lot of orders that came about in around that time. From the 1850s to the 1920s, there were a lot of these, occultist, esoteric type orders that came about. Theosophy is another one that I think I might actually touch upon theosophy a little bit in a different podcast, depending on where we go with this. But it's another one of those syncretic orders that came about around this time. But yeah, this one, the Typhonian Ordo Templi Orientis is the Typhonian order that identified with Lovecraft's mythos, and the guy who created it was named Kenneth Grant. And so, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing.
Oh, okay. But yeah, the article that I have here on him says that he combined the interest in Lovecraft's fiction with his adherence to Aleister Crowley's Thelema. So yeah, it's a hodgepodge of various occultist and esoteric theologies and philosophies. So I guess you could say there is some legitimacy to the claim that there might be something there in Lovecraft's mythology. It's called the Lovecraft mythos for a reason. It's not so much called the Lovecraft story, which I think is kind of an attribution to how it's evolved as well. Because you have Lord of the Rings, which kind of evolved as a more or less a legendarium. That's how people refer to it. Tolkien's legendarium. You have people refer to C.S. Lewis's Narnia as more so of a story, and then you have people refer to Lovecraft as a mythos. And I think all of these have varying levels of significance, with corresponding how they actually portray these various principles, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you can even see that in the time that they all lived, with this furthering interest into the occult, like you were just mentioning, which you have very prominent figures in history like Rasputin, who was part of the various orders of Russian mystics that were involved in the higher society of Russian elites and aristocracy before their whole revolution came about. And even though their orders sort of derived from a certain Christian perspective, because he was very much an Orthodox monk, he was still at the same time very occultish in his philosophy and how he demonstrated these thoughts and interests, not just from his own experiences, but from the desires and more or less degeneracies of the Russian aristocracy of the time as well. And they sort of fused together in this weird spiritualism, in a sense, and that was present all across the world, again, somewhat as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, but also through various different issues that the world was grappling with at this time. And this was all sort of overshadowing this coming war that would be World War I, and then moving on into World War II, which in a way, World War II serves as a foundational mythos for the global American empire and much of the modern politics of our time as well. And that is, in and of itself, a mythos. It is the belief system on which justifies how Western politics and beyond are played out, and how many people view the world altogether.
Yeah. Rasputin is one of those figures, too, that you brought him up. He's one of those figures, too, that, it's very... It lends a lot of credibility to the idea of practitioners of the occult actually achieving something. To the degree to which he had influence over Russian events, as well as to the fact that he just didn't die, there could be something...
Yeah, that's...
there could be something legitimate about the stuff that he did. Legitimate in the sense that it works, not in the sense that it might be proper or the best thing to do.
And there are all the historical scientists that are practitioners of scientism, like we've mentioned so many times before, that try to explain away all these things as well and theorize, oh, well, it could have been this that was actually at play. It wasn't any sort of mysticism or supernatural events at work. But that's really just theorization at the end of it, and none of these people really have the forensic evidence that they need to justify those claims, despite some of the historical evidence that may have led credence to their theories, but also are completely inconclusive, especially with how effective Rasputin was as a holy man and as this charismatic figure. On top of that, there was the occult and other aspects too, which the Freemasons and other secret societies, of course, get into. The Hellfire Club was another one that started at this time. Various different secret societies in the rising influence of the American Empire, and so forth. And it's these figures of the occult that aren't necessarily satanic, but usually almost always delve into because of the nature of what they're trying to discover or rediscover, in a sense, because occult means hidden knowledge, and it's this pursuit of some sort of hidden or mystified knowledge, kind of like that fruit that Adam and Eve first bit upon in the Garden of Eden, that all of these people are trying to get after and trying to get a leg up on in our temporal world to gain power or control, or even just a higher spiritual understanding.
Yeah.
Like what people like Styx Hexenhammer 666 tries to do. And he's a weird guy in and of itself, but he's one of those people that tries to look at the occult in a much more innocent manner based on his own experiences of unexplainable paranormal things. And so he may be atheistic in a sense, but not completely closed off to the idea, because there are things in his life that he knows scientifically aren't explainable. And that's the case with so many things. Like I mentioned, the Green Berets that were dispatched to go fight the Nephilim, or other historical accounts like of battles between Roman legions and sea serpents that caused great casualties to a Roman legion en troop to a battle that is a historical fact happened. And it's these strange things like Marco Polo's adventures into the East and other places around the world that European travelers hadn't really seen yet. And he'd give accounts of other great mythical beings, or strange peoples like those who lived, the dog-headed peoples who lived on an island on their own in I think it was Asia Minor too, near there, between India and China somewhere.
Yeah.
But a whole bunch of different weird stuff that is given, presented as like historical fact by the first person accounts of all these things. These people who contemporarily we would say delved into the occult, and that modern scientism wants to dismiss, modern historians want to dismiss it, even if they take Marco Polo's word as gospel for almost everything else in which he wrote down and experienced in his travels into the East. Things like those dog-headed people, they're like, no, that didn't actually happen. He was just on opium or something. And it's like, are you sure about that? Because there's the occult is very much part of all this mythos in a way too, and very much relevant to things like Christianity and whatnot as well, because they are questions that things like the Bible do have answers to in relation to creatures like the basilisk, or other creatures of mythology like the unicorn, which are referenced at times in the Bible. And these are things that people throughout the generations have experienced, or something that they witnessed that was beyond the normal realm of nature, that went, okay, that's weird. And our ancestors weren't dumb. And then you have people like Dave Paulides, who does the Missing 411 Project, if you've heard of that, accounting for many of these various strange, almost paranormal occurrences that happen in our national parks that our governments are kind of covering up, much like I keep bringing up the Nephilim story with the Green Berets, because there are people that genuinely claim to have had that experience, had that encounter of a U.S. military combat unit fighting this biblical monster of a man. It all comes around to these mythoses, because who knows if that's some biblical being coming down and being like, yeah, humanity's still more or less deranged, but that's for us to find out more or less in the future.
Yeah. So one last thing I wanted to get into was the contemporary translations of these literary traditions, which began with, people like Tolkien and Lovecraft and everything. So one of my main interests in mythology came from an interest in contemporary, popular culture, various synthetic or fictional mythologies like Star Wars or things like that. And I actually had a big interest in World of Warcraft. I still kind of do, as a teenager, and that's one of the things that caused me to take a mythology class, was the interest I had as a kid. First of all, my grandpa and my grandma were very adamant about teaching me various worlds mythologies, but then at the same time that I signed up for a mythology class, I started diving into these various worlds of contemporary culture, and there are a lot of the same elements within these fictitious narratives as well. World of Warcraft being one of the best examples, in my opinion, because it does have so many correspondences with these primordial principles as well. Whether or not this is a intentional thing on behalf of the writers, or if this is a just like an accidental thing that came about, there are still so many correspondences. For example, there are these titanic beings who make more or less immortal people who then become cursed and become mortalized. And these are the precursors to men in the universe. There's this idea of a fountain of knowledge and great people, a great civilization of people who were next to this fountain, who it was kind of their divine source, and they were immortal as well, until they kind of fell in character. There was, the same myth of the wicked men and everything. They became wicked themselves. They invited demons into their their domain, and this resulted in this huge cataclysmic event, which flooded the area, much like Atlantis. And as soon as they were cut off from this divine source, they became mortal as well. They lost a lot of their life source. And that's just one example within the Warcraft universe. But, for example, another one would be like Star Wars. There's a lot of things that are touched upon in the older legends of Star Wars, not so much the newer Disney ruled over ones, but in the older legends of Star Wars, there's a lot of this idea of light and dark. Obviously, you have the Jedi and the Sith, light side and dark side, and all of that. But then there's this idea of the gray Jedi, of the path of the mystic, for example. And so these are just some things that kind of correspond to symbologies in various world religions, and even like various world events that have been mythologized, that then become interpreted into books and video games and movies and TV shows and everything. But one thing I wanted to touch upon before we kind of examine modern contemporary interpretations of mythology and implementations of these interpretations is this idea of allegory within stories versus symbology. I myself am a big proponent against, and I'm a big advocate against using allegory in most cases. It can be done, but if you're looking to create a holistic narrative, then allegory is probably not the place to go for that, because what you're really trying to do is translate, exactly an event into a story, which more or less kind of corresponds with the world around it, which is crafted because of the story. Whereas symbology is more so things like, like I said before, you have the solar principles, you have the myth of the fall, the cycles of time. These are symbols, but they're not translated exactly into people's worlds. They're translated more or less abstractly and in various ways, which kind of correspond to the characteristic of the world into which they're translated. So that's just an aside. But I know that a lot of stories today get mistaken for having a symbolic character when really they have an allegorical character to them. And that's my problem with a lot of contemporary fiction, is that it's a replacement of a real world event, symbolizing a real world phenomenon that has happened in history, most recent history, or is symbolized as having taken place like right now, as a struggle that's going on right now. And a lot of that, for me, makes this story lose a lot of its integral and timeless value. It really relates it and links it to time and place. But also it seems a bit to me like a bit of a creative drag on the writer's part. But that's just kind of an aside from me. But do you have any popular culture myths to kind of reference before we get into these different interpretations?
Well, I did want to touch upon American folklore a bit, and then that would delve into the pop culture myths, getting into like the left-right dichotomy and the transhumanist thing, if we can go along that progression.
Yeah, sure. You're really quiet, though.
Oh, sorry, I backed away from my mic a little bit. With American folklore, it's interesting, too, because now we have these, just like with the Brothers Grimm, these stories that are very culturally relevant, but culturally, how would you say, isolated. Whereas they're not these grandiose explanations of the world like mythology proper would be, and they're easily translatable across cultures because there's these very clear overlaps and parallels and everything else. They're more for a time and place wholly reflective of the stories. Things like Paul Bunyan or George Washington cutting down his father's cherry tree, things like that, where you can have a fictional character altogether talking about the um, colonization of the Western United States and Manifest Destiny, and this exhibition of the American spirit and American dream, for lack of a better term, through a figure like Paul Bunyan, or through a real historical character like George Washington and the mythos around him, much like we have around Caesar or Alexander the Great
Sorry about that.
and these other great figures of history. And a demonstration of Washington's honesty and virtue as a man, and later to become the president and one of the founding fathers of the United States. And it's these exemplifying folklore that really give the character to an independent peoples. Whereas, like I was mentioning before, with the whole making sure that we're not othering those when we're on this spiritual journey and pursuit above just the temporal nature of humanity, we can't completely detach ourselves from our physical reality as well, because that's kind of impossible, at least in our state of being. Um, and it is nice to have this connection and build this community around these shared stories that are reflective of the society we're brought up in and help to mold as well. And it's this carrying of tradition that eventually does turn into a larger mythos that helps guide future generations upon uh, aeons of wisdom that we can see in other mythological explanations of the world. And that's what we're seeing a lot of the destruction of now. In a interesting bit of American folklore in this respect is that of John Henry and his fight against the drilling machine. If none of you are familiar, there, I believe it is John Henry. Just double checking. Yes. Okay. Just wanted to make sure because I've made gaffes in the past. Um, he's a tale of what the American dream could be, even for a former slave. And although he isn't depicted as that in the story, he is a black man in America, and we all kind of know the history and how that's bled out into the rest of the world and infected this racial paradigm across the political realm. But even then, in the late 18th, early 19th hundreds, we have John Henry being this mountain of a man, kind of like Paul Bunyan, and using his strength and wit and just will of character to overcome even the simulacrum of mechanized industry, and how that's becoming this transhumanist vision of the future of our current elites in depictions like the video game Deus Ex, or even in beloved figures like Elon Musk, which are going down this route of kind of transhumanist singularity type of planning. And it's kind of anti-human in a lot of ways, because it's this meshing of man and machine and departing from what makes us most human. Like we brought up before, this departure from nature, and how this rebellion against God or nature or the way of being will ultimately destroy us or hurt us in the long run, and very well probably the short run too. And John Henry was one of the early depictions of this human spirit overcoming even the most efficient and inhuman machinery that tried to bore a hole through a mountain, which is how the story goes. That kind of translates to, and like I said, with the Deus Ex video game, but also in these readaptations of popular culture, like the Lovecrafts and the Tolkiens and whatnot else, like what's going on with the Amazon series, bringing up a sort of prologue. Is it?
It's more so.
What's
It's actually the one which corresponds to the second era, the myth of the fall
Yeah.
and the flood and everything.
What is that called though? It's not a prologue. It's a
Oh, like a prequel.
prequel. Thank you. It's like a prequel series that they're trying to make, and it you can see very very much it does not understand what Tolkien was trying to convey with his original work, and they just inject and destroy essentially the architecture that he built around this narrative and the symbology it used, and instead have all these contemporary political agendas and facades and veneers that are using it as an aesthetic to further their own short-sighted goals. And that's a bit related to this simulacrum that I'm referring to, this transhumanist agenda, because they think, and this kind of gets into the left-right dichotomy of mythology, where this fundamental misunderstanding of leftists or anti-human agenda as is that just changing the word of something, using different words, will somehow change reality itself. And before I get too far into it, it is kind of related to a podcast I listened to from Zero Books, if any of you are familiar with that, and it was on Prometheus, Gaia, and Marxism, and the failing of modern mythology from the left. But I don't want to go on another tangent like I did with the occult thing and get too far ahead. So, Vincent, if you have anything to add.
No, I think for right now, we can just kind of take it that direction. Kind of going back to what you said about the instance with George Washington and the apple tree and the various characters which get mythologized and deified. Actually, almost the whole idea of the Roman patrician caste is deified individuals, in the sense that they are men who either have risen to the status of being descended from a god, or no, sorry, they are men who have been risen to the status of a god, or men who have descended from someone who has risen to the status of being a god. And the same kind of idea corresponds to the Norse idea. Even the modern Nordic kings, modern Nordic royalties, still trace their lineage back to Odin. And so there's this idea of
Egypt did the same thing with the pharaoh too, right?
Yeah, definitely. With the embodiment of Osiris and stuff like that. So there's a lot of repetition of the symbol of embodying a deified individual, or by being the impersonation of a deity. And so you mentioned like George Washington becoming mythologized in that regard. That's kind of an echo of what we see in history, that we still see being passed down today in the Nordic lineage. That's about it.
And it's that's fine. But it is very reflective of how that shapes culture and how that motivates people moving forward. Because with going back to the American context, it was a whole revolution that was fought against the largest empire of the world at the time, that was seemingly a Sisyphean task, to relate it back to previous mythology. And then you have this small group of more or less elites that wanted to help the common man be rid of this empire that's then exploiting them across the sea, that they don't really have any connection to anymore other than a common ancestry. And so this task is brought on that is very much like the feats of Jason or Hercule or so on, by the founding fathers, to rid themselves of this hydra, this proverbial hydra of the British Empire. And that's even how it was depicted well into the Victorian era and beyond, with its caricature of this old English gentleman, top hat, monocle, and octopus-like arms stretching over the globe and controlling various parts of the world. And the American people wanted to be part of that and cut this head of the Hydra off, burn its stump, and create its own destiny. And that's why you get this mythological status of these figures like George Washington and so forth. And that really propels and motivates the rest of the American people pushing forward to go on to commit to such great feats like the Manifest Destiny and expansion of the West, and then the technological revolutions that occurred because of our more or less isolation of the world, then expanding into our own empire, the World War II and World War One, and our feats of bravery and I guess masculinity at the height of what would be our empire then at the time, and then going up technologically to the space race and departing from this earthly realm and actually piercing the heavens, like the famous speech that Kennedy gave, and being able to land on another planet, essentially land on the moon, do something that would have been inconceivable to anyone throughout all of human history. And it's still kind of hard for people to kind of get their heads around really and truly on the significance of that kind of achievement. And that's all stemming from this original history and then morphed mythology of the founding fathers and so forth.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's very interesting to like hear you put that all into perspective. But I think we should kind of segue into the last topic of the day's episode, because we are going about 2 hours and 40 minutes as of right now.
Ooh, we warned you all. We warned you.
Yeah. So yeah, you can go ahead and start that out, because I remember you wanted to bring up the podcasts and stuff that you watched and the various perspectives on the left-right dichotomy, and so go ahead and introduce it, and then I actually have some stuff to say as well. So
awesome. So in researching this video, I was trying to get multiple perspectives on things, and that included trying to look at the leftist perspective of mythology and how they kind of grapple with the situation. And like I mentioned, there is a podcast episode from Zero Books interviewing two characters, or I shouldn't say characters, but two men that were writing a book on the modern failings of the Gaian and Promethean myths and how they relate to leftism and Marxism in general. And that was a very difficult podcast to get through, and it contrasted quite greatly with a podcast that was hosted by Aaron McIntyre, including the Distributist, Morgoth, Last Things, and they were all talking about Dune, all just ahead of the release of the new iteration, the new movie that came out, that I saw myself and was actually quite good. But they were discussing the importance too of mythology and of narrative writing and more reactionary politics in general, but going on to a higher degree of intellectual thought and care in the character of these stories and these myths than what I saw was demonstrated on the left perspective. Because there was one of the authors just outright saying, I believe his name was... it doesn't matter. If you can, what was it? Yeah, Landon Frim, just outright said that we can and should modify reality to the degree of the human nature we want to build, more or less, and that kind of just fundamentally flies in the face of nature itself, but human nature more specifically. And what I felt was the overlapping or reoccurring trip up that these leftists seem to keep bringing themselves to when talking about mythology. But there was another thing he said that just outright conceded that, oh, well, the right, he said fascists, that they can talk about mythology and spirituality and stuff like that because leftists pigeonhole themselves in to this scientism, this secularism, all these different isms that they try to psychologize the world around. And it falls on its face because there's no motivating factor, there's no human nature, there's no real relationship between these ideas and the reality. There's much like what Marx and Engels were, armchair philosophers that were bourgeois themselves. And that's always what it fails to demonstrate, and what it always comes down to in their interpretations of these myths, which comes back to these reiterations of things like J.R.R. Tolkien's work, or so on. Like even with Star Wars, you'll have these more progressive, these more leftists, these more Marxist type of individuals that fundamentally don't understand what makes these myths or these stories or these narratives have staying power, which is what it's kind of called in the research of mythology, is why they last for aeons, why they have this universal appeal and this alluring nature to them that makes us sympathetic or makes us vitriolic towards different characters and their motivations, and even makes us confused and uneasy because it helps us confront different problems in society, in our own nature, with the very existence of God itself. And the leftists kind of just reject that outright, whereas the conversation with the guys on the right, the Aaron McIntyres, Distributists, Morgoth, and the last things, are all kind of presuming that these are truths in and of themselves to go off of, which is what the rest of human history has kind of had as a template, where we're assuming there is some god or divinity that exists and that is kind of demonstrated of a higher human value beyond just the theory of material human means and motivations themselves. And that is how our interactions with ourselves and wider society kind of go down. And how I think that this may help bridge the gap with many people on the left who might be wanting to get out of the left but don't know how, because they just reject these fundamental truths and axioms outright, and how we can take some people from the right and not have them so fractalized and disunified because they try to make myths out of themselves, in a sense, or myths out of their own movements, and why they're so insular and combative even amongst each other. You want to add on from there?
Yeah. So the idea of mythology being interpreted by the left is very symbolic of a misunderstanding of the nature of what leftism is. Julius Evola wrote a whole bunch about what the idea of the true right is versus what the idea of the modern right likes to claim is right, and then the idea of actual leftism. And so there's different ways in which these myths can be interpreted, obviously. Even different cults within Greece, different ethnicities and tribes within the same general area, not just in Greece, but in everywhere, had different interpretations of these myths, but in no way did these myths ever correspond to a promotion of secularism, materialism, nihilism, atheism. In no way did they promote or substantiate the idea of communism in the sense of the end of equality. They did not substantiate the idea of equitarianism, I guess you could say. And so hearing you talk about these the various podcasts that you watched almost makes me think that there is a level of dissonance there when interpreting the various mythologies from a left-wing perspective. It's in the same way that I say that we should abstract these principles to find the truth of the matter in what may be something we don't totally understand as humans. It seems that that goes on the opposite scale, especially in secular conversations, which correspond more so to leftist conversations, that abstract these myths to be more social symbols and symbols of society rather than symbols of reality. So I feel like where leftists are concerned, and where materialists are concerned, and secularists and atheists, and especially people of that sort, are concerned more so with the idea of pushing a morality that is connected to relativity. Because in most cases, these people are not amoral. They're not, I guess you could say, they are not, I guess amoral would be the correct term. I mean, they still abide by a morality. It just, this morality is subject to change and doesn't have a source in something that is beyond physicality or beyond materialism. So it could be a morality based in people's feelings. It could be a morality based in monetary value. It could be a morality based in the idea of a government, or the idea of no government, or the idea of equality, or communitarianism by having an equality of economics or equality of material allocation. All of these things have in common a very relative character, a very material character, and have no basis in anything higher. So the way... Oh, go ahead.
If I may, yeah. And that's part of the very tragic and confusing irony that kind of befalls leftism, is because, like you're saying right now, they have this totally materialistic, but at the same time completely arbitrary conception of the world that's very much based on a more or less bastardization of Hegel's work. But what they also keep referring to with Spinoza and Marx in conceiving this worldview of pure thought, where the translation of thinking something how it ought to be or how it could be necessarily translates into what you can make of it in the real world. And that's just not how it works. And why I kept bringing up the transhumanist thing is because there's a good quote from Milo Yiannopoulos where he kind of hit the nail on the head, saying that people think you can just change the words you use and that changes the reality of the matter, but you can't. And that was the fundamental misunderstanding that these guys in this Zero Books podcast had. And what I see on things like the questions of AI or transgenderism or whatever you may call it, etc., all wholly depend on this pure subjectivity and this pure arbitrary reality and moral relativism that exists, despite them being total hardcore materialists and adherents of this secular scientism that they try to pigeonhole and box everyone else around them with. Yet they're so antic and seemingly mentally ill because there's no connection to the real world with these thoughts in their conception of the world, because it's so detached. It's so, for lack of a better term, what is it? The liberal term for singularity, the single person.
Atomized?
Individualist.
Oh.
That's what it is. It's so individualist in its nature. And it kind of just destroys their own conception of the world in just the announcement of it, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I do get what you mean. And you can contrast that with the view of myth from the right. And, there's I would say there's a split in the right, especially along these lines. One end of the right corresponds to a very naturalistic and Darwinistic perspective of things. And they essentially live by the rule of, might makes right and stuff. We kind of touched upon that with the Aristotelian capital P politics episode. But there's one area of the right which does kind of correspond to Darwinism and the doctrine of the strong, and another which corresponds to the doctrine of the righteous, or the more so religious element of society. And only one of these areas I consider to be legitimate, and that's the one with its basis in something a little bit more absolute. But as an interpretation of these myths, you can contrast the left with this more holistic, traditional-minded right, who interprets these myths not as subordinated to the human principle, but as superior to it. It is superior to the human principle in the sense that it predates humanity. It predates the existence of a lot of things. It is, very much preordainment, and the idea of the right in politics is trying to align with your function within the world, where the idea of the left in politics is to align the world with your idea of what you should be. It's very subjective, and so that's the way in which I would differentiate the interpretations of mythology based on the examples you've given.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense, and it's just odd because I try to understand where these people are coming from and where their mentality leads them. But like you said, I think a while ago now, there's a certain cognitive dissonance that happens when they approach these subjects because they have to fundamentally reject these axioms outright. Otherwise, their worldview collapses in on themselves because it is this armchair intellectualism that is completely arbitrary to the rest of reality, and they try to force it upon everything else and fit it to their narrative. Hence why I keep referring back to those reiterations of older tales, like the Amazon's Lord of the Rings iteration. Fundamentally misunderstands Tolkien's writings, even outside of Tolkien's own morality and narrative that he built and imbued upon from his perspective. Just the narrative itself as a story, they will destroy by trying to fit these inorganic philosophies into the world and into the characters that otherwise should not be there.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think this is a good place to wrap this episode up. What do you think?
I did have two pop culture, I guess, franchises that we could go off of that some people may not be aware of, because we talked about the big figures of last century, but not so much the prospects of this new millennia, if you will.
Sure. I'm actually kind of interested in what you have to say, because I remember you mentioning one, but not the other.
Yes. The two are, and this might be surprising to some people, Avatar: The Last Airbender of Nickelodeon fame, and The Hunger Games of the book series and movie franchise fame. And they might not be the first sort of images that come about when talking about narrative and the capital T traditionalists and so forth, but they very much are when you start to analyze things, especially in a contemporary context with the Hunger Games and how reflective it is of our current paradigm, whether or not that was a conscious writing of things from the Hunger Games author. I forget her name. I'll look it up in a second.
Something Collins. Suzanne Collins.
Suzanne Collins, thank you. Whether that was a conscious effort from Suzanne Collins or not, it's very much the effect and the consequence thereof. And leftists kind of appropriate it to be this sort of left revolutionary Marxian frame, but it really fails. That's why they kind of stick to the Harry Potter's sorts of deals, even though that's a whole different conversation of itself too, which it doesn't really land on. But you could even argue that Katniss, the protagonist of the Hunger Games series, is this Artemis-like figure, this virgin goddess of the forest that um, will punish man for their folly, more or less. And that's not to make it like a woo-woo go feminists girl power type of move. It's more so a very traditionally feminine type of um, vengeance, like hell hath no fury like a woman's scorn sort of deal.
Like
And you see that.
a rebellion of Hera, or perhaps an Amazonian principle.
Yes, exactly. Because Katniss does have her flaws and does have her moments of weakness and does have um, points where she nearly dies, if not for the rescue or wit of other characters, especially the masculine counterparts to herself, her love interests, and her pseudo father-like figures. And they all make different sacrifices um, and different contributions to the world around them uh, in this revolution that are very much this traditional masculine feminine dynamic that we see so often explained in these mythologies of old. But in Avatar: The Last Airbender, it's a whole different type of traditionalist perspective, and something that I thought of when thinking about the Aaron McIntyre stream with talking about Dune, because they were discussing how we bring about a new generation of writers, of artists, of people that can bring about our own mythos to really give a tradition in combating the degradation of society that we're seeing before us, or at least to give to generations proceeding from the destruction of civilization as we know it, which every day seems closer and closer as we get to it. The clock of Armageddon is getting closer to midnight, as we will. And in this, I see Avatar: The Last Airbender, just the first series, not mentioning Legend of Korra, which I know some people might be worried about. Just looking at Avatar: The Last Airbender is a very, very unique and useful iteration of this traditionalist perspective that those older guys might not be aware of. Because they are more the Gen X, older millennial types, whereas Zoomers like ourselves might be much more familiar with a show like this. I know I was being raised and growing up alongside this show as it came out, and it was just utterly fascinating because, cool magic, karate, the exotic natures of these Asian cultures being translated into a wholly fictional world. But then, as a teenager and as an adult, rewatching this show over and over again, you get completely different messages and how to deal with things like the coming of age, the responsibilities of tradition, and moving forward with keeping that tradition alive, the consequences of an extinction level event or a genocide, the horrors of war, and the heroes of it as well. This clash of cultures and elements that have natural opposition to each other, but also can bring unity in each other, and this mastery of the physical world through the spiritual and vice versa. And it's constant themes like this that are presented through the show that are easy for both a child to understand, but go much deeper for adults to explore as well. And that's something I encourage everyone to look into, because I genuinely claim it to be one of the best written shows of our entire generation. And it's not that it is political in our contemporary sense, where everything is infested by our politics of the day and newsfeed and current events, but it's a completely self-contained politics that has that symbolism like Vincent was talking about, and not an allegory at all to real-world events. Avatar: The Last Airbender might be one of those foundational shows and narratives to inspire other people on how to write a very good, if not reactionary, then just capital T traditionalist.
I'm so glad you said that.
Story.
I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah.
I forgot. Sorry. Good.
But to keep that going. and what I might be doing myself in trying to create my own narrative. And it's well over a year now. I've started writing out notes and actually starting to write scripts on a comic series, me being kind of a weeb, inspired mostly by the graphic novels of manga, which is the truest form of this story that I want to make it in. But starting first with just writing it as like a book in my own sort of grand narrative, like Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or Lovecraft and so on, and making these characters and world with a sort of architectural vision on where it begins and where it ends, but more or less an architect of a garden, if you will, combining both the attributes of the ways in writing. Whereas I know the complete confines of the world I'm creating, but I don't know how the characters and events in the world will grow. And leaving some of them open-ended so that I can have other people contribute who might help in that vision of this traditionalist's future that we all hope to build in these narratives.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that too, because you reminded me of a topic which I introduced in the beginning of the episode that I completely forgot about. Because, you know, the episode,
hours worth of content.
The episode has taken its toll on my mind. But yeah, I did mention that. Yeah, we have some narrative projects that we've been working on ourselves, and so yours is more so dedicated to trying to, I guess, storycraft and weave in these various themes within a narrative of your own, right?
Yeah, it's to just give people the rundown without revealing too much, because I want to keep, until I publish this, I want to keep it all very close to the chest.
Right.
It's inspired from my dog, more or less, and that may seem like a really weird starting point to go off of, but in this evolution of the thought of my narrative came from raising my dog as a puppy, and she was a gift from my neighbor whose dogs then had a litter, and so this dog is just absolutely adorable, very like the biggest of her litter, healthy, strong, beautiful, and just a good soul. You can see it in how she interacts with everybody. And so I wanted to kind of make like Avatar: The Last Airbender, a story that can be first introduced with children and be from the perspective of a child. My dog's character coming about and growing up in a world that has a traditional dichotomy to it, and then growing with the audience as the story develops. So she develops into from a young child to a teenager to a young adult, more or less, where it leaves off and goes towards the end. And all of these concepts, like were mentioned with Avatar: The Last Airbender, of genocide and war and the battle of spirituality and the physical world, and how this affects the grand nature of reality itself. Very heavy, deep concepts that will be eased into as the reader develops themselves, so that there's a genuine appreciation for the story as you go along, and things don't get too intense off the bat, so that it's just a R-rated fiasco like what most people may think of as Berserk, which is a fantastic series in and of itself, but it's not going to be a totally G-rated adventure like, I don't know, like Avatar: The Last Bender either.
Yeah, I see. I really like that idea, especially as it kind of like gauges into it. I see you're more oriented towards like exposing the reader to the story, which is something that's kind of in contrast to what I'm doing for my sort of mythos as well. Because I was inspired by I played these games when I was younger, and I like I mentioned before, like World of Warcraft and all that. And I was inspired by that. I really like the scenery with the very, I don't know if you've ever played the game, but it's a very beautiful world. And it's got this nice ambience to it, and it's a very, very beautiful game, and it sucks
What
you
game?
in. Warcraft.
Oh, gotcha.
But yeah, it's got this very beautiful world, very well crafted. Even if you don't know much about it, just simply playing the game and feeling the atmosphere of the world was something that I liked. I liked myself, especially when I didn't know much of the lore. And so this inspired me to kind of read the lore of various other universes as well. And so that's how I got into Tolkien. I actually got into Tolkien through World of Warcraft. But after I read his mythos, I read Lord of the Rings first, then I read the Silmarillion, and then I read The Hobbit. Funny enough, I read the easiest one last. But I was inspired by him as well, by looking at how he has crafted this fully holistic meta-narrative with many smaller narratives within it. And I said, okay, well, I like the world of Tolkien. I like the world of Warcraft. I like the Star Wars universe as well. That was another big inspiration for me. And I like all these various worlds. Let me try my hand at creating something. And so it began as just this this hodgepodge of various like fantasy ideas for just a generic world. No story included, unless it was in some way describing something that came about in the world, like like how this race came about or something. No like actual characters or anything, And so as time went on, and I developed this world, I kind of came into the ideas of various philosophers as well. I became very knowledgeable of different esoteric concepts, like the concepts that we've been talking about here. And as I found them, I was like, okay, well, let me play with this and put it into my world and see how well it fits. Things like vampirism, things like the degrees of reality, emanationism, the idea of the monad, all of this stuff, solar principles and lunar principles, and I was the idea of day and night, or the idea of a time before a day. This was all stuff that I thought of putting in my world as just as a general creative direction. But then I noticed the stuff that I've been wanting to put in more or less pop up in these various philosophic and esoteric texts that I've been reading as well. So it was almost like a kind of like a, what's that word that like a not a syncretism, but a synchronicity. Yeah, it was a synchronicity between the stuff that I was thinking of putting in just from a creative perspective to the stuff that I was learning by reading these various philosophers. And so sometimes I would take an idea from some philosophy or another, I would play with it in my world, I would see how it would fit into the world, and then I would eventually come to an understanding about that concept itself and how it relates to current reality and like actual, real life, by understanding it through the lens of using it creatively. And so as of now, I don't have much of a direction that I want to go in story-wise, but I know the elements that I want to have within the world. I want to have not so much, I want to make it more so a narrative expression of what we call praxism. And so a lot of this stuff is very abstract, what we deal with. So I won't have necessarily a certain number of degrees to reality, but rather a gradient to reality, going from absolute to relative. I won't have necessarily a god with a personality or a name, but a monad that can be interpreted by the various inhabitants of the world in different ways. So it doesn't necessarily, there's no necessarily one cosmogonic formulation, but a justification of cosmogony itself. That's kind of the direction I wanted to go in with my world. And then within that, I would write various, sword and sorcery type stories like Conan the Barbarian or like The Hobbit.
I was just going to add, this sounds like you're going down the Conan route.
Yeah, I am. So that I can tell various fictional stories which might be more self-contained and not so much overarchingly effective of the world itself, but can be seen through the lens of the world, or can be experienced through the lens of the world. But that was kind of a project I began in 2018, and here it is 4 years later, and I've got a solid idea of where I want to go with it.
Yeah, that actually kind of reminds me of those what is it, future punk sort of 1920s
Yeah.
comic series. I think it's the Prince of Mars is one book series where it's very much like that. I might have the wrong title, but it's where this guy is transported to Mars, and he goes back between Mars and Earth, so he can only stay in Mars for a portion of the year, and he's more or less a warlord, fighting for favor of this princess that rules over a section of Mars, and it's like a Conan-like story, and it very much of that nature too, which deals with all these different concepts as well as the contemporary conflicts of the 20s and so on.
That's really cool. I might have to look into that. Yeah, it's essentially something like that. And so a large part of what inspires me actually is looking at various aesthetic pieces of art and trying to see like, oh, if I put this in, this is what this would be. This is what that would be. But you know when you go to a store and you see something that looks like it was from like a video game or movie or whatever, it's like some like medieval thing, and it almost feels more authentic if it doesn't have a story behind it. You know what I mean? Like if it's connected to a certain TV show, like if it's a Game of Thrones, something or other, it feels, less authentic than if you didn't know what it was. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
That's the kind of feel that I want to give to my world. I don't want there to be necessarily anything from it, but more so something that can feel like it's from it. You know what I mean?
Where it's like a mythology sort of series,
like
but they're all sharing the same universe.
Exactly like that. That's the kind of creative direction I'm going to go with. And funny enough, I guess if this is of any interest, the world itself is like the physical manifestation of the world. So like what we would call Earth, I've called Eartha, which is a combination of Earth and ether. So like an ethereal realm.
Oh, that's actually pretty cool.
Thank you. But yeah, I've taken some time. A lot of this development stuff has been taking place in my head. I'm sure you probably can relate before putting it on paper. So I know a lot more about what I want rather than what I have, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But anyways.
I think I found it. It's A Princess of Mars by
Princess of Mars.
Edgar Rice Burroughs.
I've heard of this, yeah.
All right. I think that's it now.
Yeah, I haven't read it or anything like that, but I have seen it, like seen the various images and things like that. Yeah, I'm reading. I just looked it up. I'm reading the synopsis and stuff. Yeah, I have heard of this. I don't know why I didn't click, but anyways, I think this is a good place to wrap it up. What do you say?
I think I got to everything I wanted to talk about, and sorry to the listener if this was very long, but I hope it was well worth it.
Oh yeah, we've gone well over 3 hours, definitely. But I do think it was a very, very substantial conversation. There was a lot of stuff to unpack here, and I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty tired.
Yeah, it's time to eat.
Yeah, time to eat. But yeah, I would like to thank everyone for listening in to today's episode. We touched upon a lot of concepts that hopefully inspires some more research for the listener to go in and dive deep into. And if you're interested in finding other places to contact us, all of our social media links will be in the description down below, and you may submit an application and join our community on Guilded as well if you'd like to join the discourse. Thank you once again to you, Cody.
As always.
And my name is Vincent. I hope to see you next time at the Praxist Table Talks.